Her name was Netravati. It is a novel about a brave young lady, Netravati, who led the masses to the revolution they had never imagined. Author Shri.
Rajeev Shantalam Thatte.
Chapter 1. The beginning of the storm. In a small, dusty town nestled on the fringes of the war-torn borderlands, there lived a girl whose name would one day become synonymous with strength, resilience, and defiance. Her name was Netravati, though she had not yet earned that title. Not yet. The town, unnamed by the world beyond, was a place where survival was the currency. People lived not by their dreams, but by the daily grind of staying alive. Each day was an act of endurance, and each night a prayer that dawn would come. The young girl, with her dark eyes and untamed hair, grew up amid these struggles. Her father, once a soldier, had left for the front lines years ago, and her mother worked long hours in the fields to provide for their small family. Netravati, however, was not a passive child. She had a fire in her heart that no amount of hardship could quench. Even as a young girl, she often stood up for those who were too afraid to speak, whether it was an older woman being pushed aside by the local militia, or a child who had been bullied for something they couldn't control. But the true test of her strength came on the day the soldiers returned. It was a day like any other, with the sun beating down on the parched earth and the wind carrying the dust of 100 forgotten years. But there was something in the air that felt different. Heaviness, a warning. And then they came, soldiers in military trucks, their faces obscured by masks of indifference. The town held its breath. The military had long ago turned this place into a staging ground for their operations. And while they had never been particularly kind to the residents, they had been mostly passive. But today, something had changed. The soldiers disembarked with grim expressions, their movements swift and purposeful. "They're here for the harvest," someone whispered. "They are taking it all." The town had lived in fear of such a moment, but it had always been an unspoken hope that they would be spared, that somehow they would be overlooked in favor of more valuable targets. But the soldiers were methodical. They began rounding up the townspeople, pushing them into the central square. Netravati stood in the middle of the dusty road, watching as her mother, pale and trembling, was forced into the crowd. Something stirred within her, a feeling she could neither name nor ignore. The girl's heart raced, her mind scrambling for a solution, a way out. She glanced at her mother, who met her eyes with a look of silent fear, fear for herself, for the town, but most of all, for her daughter. Without thinking, Netravati ran forward, her small frame slipping through the sea of soldiers. She reached the front of the crowd where the commander stood, barking orders with a sneer. "Hey!" Netravati shouted, her voice surprisingly strong for a girl of her size. The commander paused, his gaze falling upon the defiant child who had dared to speak. "You can't take it all," she said, her voice trembling only slightly. "It's ours. It's ours to keep. We've worked for it. You can't just take it." For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The soldiers shifted, some looking uncomfortable, others amused by the audacity of a child. The commander's eyes narrowed, and then, slowly, he crouched down to her level. "You think you can stop us?" he asked, his voice low and menacing. Netravati stood her ground. I think you don't have the right. The commander smirked. Rights don't matter here. Little girl, strength does. And I am strong. The words hung in the air for a moment, but then something unexpected happened. The silence was broken by a loud crack, followed by a series of smaller cracks, like thunder on a clear day. And then, the first of the crops, ripe and ready for harvest, began to fall. A gust of wind had blown through the town, as if nature itself was protesting the injustice. It was an omen, though no one could know it then. In the midst of that chaos, Netravati's voice rang out again. If you take it all, you will take everything we have, she said, her voice a mixture of desperation and defiance. But if you take everything, what will be left for you? The commander hesitated. He had seen many things, but the resolve in the eyes of a child was something he had not expected. The soldiers behind him murmured among themselves, uncertain, but the commander's pride would not allow him to back down. Take her, he commanded, and the soldiers stepped forward, their hands grabbing her arms. But Netravati's spirit was not so easily subdued. She kicked, she fought, and her struggles only increased her determination. The soldiers were taken aback by the strength of the girl's resistance, but they overpowered her, pulling her toward the trucks. It was then that the town erupted. The people, who had been passive in their fear, found a voice, and that voice was Netravati. They rushed forward, surrounding the soldiers, yelling, screaming, and throwing whatever they could find. It was chaos, but it was also unity, a spark of rebellion. Netravati, though trapped in the soldiers' grasp, smiled. She had ignited something in her people that even she had not fully understood. In that moment, her name was no longer just a label, it was a promise. The fight for survival had begun, and no force on earth could take away their Netravati now. Chapter 2. The spark of resistance. The day after the soldiers left, the town was still reeling from the events that had unfolded. The dust had settled, but the tension in the air was palpable. Netravati's small act of defiance had ignited a spark in the hearts of the townspeople. And though the soldiers had returned to their posts and the crops had been harvested, something inside the people had changed. They could no longer accept the life of fear they had been living. Netravati, still reeling from the events of the day before, woke up early, the sun barely peeking over the horizon. Her mind buzzed with what had happened, with the power of her voice, and the way the people had rallied around her. But there was something else too, fear. Fear of what would come next. Her mother, as usual, was already up and working in the fields. But this morning, there was an air of quiet contemplation about her. When Netravati approached, her mother stopped her work and looked at her with a mixture of concern and pride. "You were brave yesterday," her mother said softly, her hands trembling slightly. "But do you understand the weight of what you've done?" Netravati nodded, her mind racing. "I do, mother. But I had to do something. I couldn't just stand by." Her mother looked at her with a sad smile. "I know, but it won't be enough. We can't face them alone. Not just you, not just us." "What do you mean?" Netravati asked, her heart sinking. She had hoped that by standing up, by making herself heard, something would change. But now her mother's words were beginning to sink in. "We need others," her mother said. "The town has been quiet for so long, afraid to fight back. But yesterday was something else. People saw your Netravati. They saw something in you they hadn't seen before, a possibility. But we need to unite. We need to organize." For the first time, Netravati realized her fight was not just about standing up in that moment. It was about creating something bigger. She had sparked a fire, but now she needed to fan the flames. Later that day, Netravati gathered with a few trusted friends and neighbors in the town's small meeting hall, a weather-beaten structure that had once been a place for community gatherings but had since fallen into disuse. The walls were cracked and the floor was uneven, but it was a place of refuge now. The windows were closed, the room dark except for the light filtering through the cracks. Netravati stood in the center, her hands clasped in front of her as she looked at the small group of people who had come. They were hesitant, unsure of what to expect, but there was a palpable sense of anticipation in the air. "Yesterday," she began, her voice steady, "we made a stand. But one stand is not enough. We need to be strong together. We need to show them that we will not bow to fear, that we will protect what is ours." An older man, his face wrinkled with age and hardship, spoke up. "And how do you suggest we do that, girl? We've been beaten down too many times. We don't have the strength to take on the soldiers." Netravati met his gaze. "We don't need to fight them head on. But we can fight back in other ways. We can stand together, speak out, refuse to give in. We need to organize. We need to become more than just a collection of individuals. We need to be a community that can't be divided, a community that won't back down." The man scoffed. "Easy for you to say. What if they come back for us?" Netravati's eyes shone with a determination that burned deep. "Then we will be ready." The room fell silent. The words hung heavy in the air. But then, one by one, the others began to nod. The quiet, timid people who had been living in fear started to feel something stir inside them. They had spent so long submitting to the will of the soldiers, accepting the injustices, but Netravati's words had awakened something in them. They had been waiting for someone to give them the strength to act, and now they had it. "We will need food, supplies," one of the women said, "and we'll need to hide to keep the soldiers from finding us. We will find ways," Netravati said, her voice firm. "We can protect each other, and when the time is right, we'll make our move." The group began to make plans. They would meet in secret, keep their actions hidden from the soldiers. They would gather information, spread word among the people, and slowly build their resistance. It was a fragile beginning, but it was the start of something far greater than anyone in that room could have imagined. As the days passed, Netravati continued to speak with the townspeople, drawing them into her vision. She knew it would take time, patience, and sacrifice, but there was no turning back now. The soldiers would return. They always did. But this time, the town would not be the same, and Netravati would not stand alone. Chapter 3. The gathering storm the town was changing. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, but there was no denying the shift in the air. People were beginning to speak more openly, gathering in small, secret groups, exchanging ideas in hushed tones. their faces drawn with concern, but also with a flicker of something new, hope. Netravati, though still only a girl, had become the spark that set everything into motion. Her words had inspired the people, and now they were looking to her for direction. Each day, she walked the narrow, dusty streets, meeting with individuals who had once been too afraid to raise their voices. She talked to the farmers, the merchants, the elderly, and even the children. They all had something to contribute, something to offer. It wasn't just about food or weapons, it was about unity, about standing together against a common enemy. Her mother, though still cautious, had supported her every step of the way. She helped organize the meetings, kept an eye out for any sign of the soldiers' return, and offered a safe place for those who needed it. But even she could feel the weight of what they were doing. The world outside was a hostile one, and every small act of resistance seemed like a provocation. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Netravati stood at the edge of the town, looking out over the fields that had once been so full of promise. Now, they were nothing more than a symbol of the people's brokenness, stolen, destroyed, their potential squandered by the greed of the soldiers and the tyrannical forces that controlled them. She clenched her fists, her jaw set in determination. There has to be more we can do, she whispered to herself. A soft voice interrupted her thoughts. You've already done so much, Netravati. She turned to see her mother, standing a few feet away, watching her with a mixture of pride and concern. Do you really think we can win? Netravati asked, her voice filled with doubt. Even if we all stand together, even if we fight back, can we really make a difference? Her mother's expression softened, and she walked over, placing a hand on her daughter's shoulder. I think you're more powerful than you know, she said. The people are with you. You've shown them that they can fight back. And that is something the soldiers will never expect. They've ruled by fear for so long. But fear is brittle. It can break. Netravati sighed, her heart heavy. I just wish I knew what the next step is, she admitted. I don't know how to defeat them. I don't know what to do next. Her mother smiled faintly. Sometimes, the next step isn't about defeating the enemy directly. It's about making them feel unsure, making them question whether they really have control. It was a simple, almost philosophical answer. But for Netravati, it sparked something inside her, a realization that the battle they were fighting didn't have to be won in one decisive moment. It was a series of small victories, a war of attrition. Over the following days, Netravati worked tirelessly, organizing scouts, spreading messages, and building alliances. She spoke with the town's leaders, urging them to set aside their differences and unite in resistance. She visited the farmers, encouraging them to hide their crops and protect what little they had. She helped the young men and women learn basic self-defense, teaching them how to stay hidden when the soldiers came, how to move without being noticed. Despite the fear, despite the danger, there was a palpable sense of purpose in the air. The people had stopped thinking of themselves as victims. They were becoming something more, a community bound by a shared resolve. One evening, as Netravati sat with a few trusted members of the resistance in the small meeting hall, a figure entered the room. It was a man, tall and wiry, his face shadowed beneath the brim of a wide hat. He was one of the older members of the town, someone who had lived through the wars that had ravaged the region years before. His name was Arjun, and his presence brought a quiet reverence to the room. "I've been watching," Arjun said in his gravelly voice. "Watching and listening. The soldiers are planning something big. They've been moving in and out of the neighboring town, preparing for something. We don't know what yet, but we've heard rumors." The room fell silent. The news was both expected and ominous. "They're going to come for us," Netravati said, her voice steady despite the rising anxiety in her chest. "Sooner or later, they will come back." Arjun nodded grimly. "They've been consolidating their power, gathering more troops. We need to act fast if we want to stay ahead of them." Netravati's mind raced. There was so much to prepare for. She had been gathering information, organizing defenses, but it was clear now that time was running out. The soldiers weren't just coming for their crops anymore. They were coming for everything. "We need to get word out to the surrounding towns," Netravati said. "We need to unite the resistance. If we wait until they come to us, it will be too late." The others nodded, understanding the urgency of the situation. It wasn't just their town at risk anymore, it was the whole region. "We will need more people," one of the women said. "More fighters, more resources. It's going to be a long road. We'll find a way," Netravati said, her voice unwavering. "We have no other choice." And so, the plan began to take shape. Over the next few days, the town's small resistance network grew. Word spread to the neighboring towns, and people began to join their cause. They brought with them weapons, supplies, and skills, turning the once peaceful town into a hub of defiance. Netravati stood at the center of it all, the weight of leadership settling heavily on her shoulders. She was no longer just the girl who had stood up to the soldiers. She had become the heart of the movement. But even as their numbers grew and their resolve strengthened, Netravati knew that the hardest part was yet to come. The storm was gathering on the horizon, and soon the town would face its greatest test. Chapter 4. The first strike days passed, and the pressure mounted. The town was no longer a quiet, oppressed place. It had transformed into a symbol of defiance, a beacon of hope for those who had lived in fear for too long. The resistance was growing stronger, but so was the danger. Every decision Netravati made felt heavier than the last, and the reality of what was coming began to set in. The soldiers would not wait forever to strike, and when they came, they would come in force. Netravati had spent her nights strategizing with her closest allies, Arjun, a few seasoned fighters from the neighboring towns, and her mother, who had become an indispensable advisor. The plan was simple, but dangerous. They would intercept the soldiers before they reached the heart of the town, striking when they least expected it. But as the days grew shorter and the deadline loomed, Netravati began to feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on her. She had spent years as a daughter, a child, and in the blink of an eye, she had become the leader of a rebellion. The townspeople looked to her for guidance, for strength, and she could feel the fear beneath their hopeful faces. They were counting on her, and the thought was both humbling and terrifying. One afternoon, as the sun beat down relentlessly on the town, Netravati stood at the town's eastern edge, her eyes scanning the horizon. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, but there was no mistaking the tension in the air. She could feel it in her bones, the calm before the storm. Arjun approached, his face set in grim determination. They've been spotted. A large force. Coming from the north. They'll be here by nightfall. Netravati's heart raced. This was it. The time for planning, for hiding, was over. The soldiers were coming, and this time, there would be no turning back. We need to move fast, Netravati said, her voice firm despite the fear gnawing at her insides. Everyone knows their role. If we hold them off here, we can slow them down long enough to give the rest of the townspeople time to escape. Arjun nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of respect and worry. We're ready, but don't underestimate them. They're well-trained, well-equipped. I know, Netravati said quietly. But we have something they don't. We have each other. As the afternoon wore on, Netravati could feel the tension in the air growing thicker. The townspeople had gathered in the fields just beyond the town's boundaries, hidden away in the tall grass and under the cover of trees. The plan was set. The resistance fighters, armed with whatever weapons they could muster, axes, knives, old rifles, were positioned strategically along the northern road, waiting for the soldiers to approach. Netravati took her place at the center of the group, flanked by Arjun and several others who had volunteered to lead the charge. She could hear the distant rumble of trucks, the unmistakable sound of the soldiers drawing near. Her stomach twisted, but she held her head high. She had no choice but to lead them now. The first wave of soldiers appeared on the horizon, their dark forms silhouetted against the setting sun. Netravati's heart skipped a beat. There were more than she had expected, far more. They were heavily armed, their armored vehicles trundling down the narrow road, the sound of their engines a growl in the distance. But Netravati didn't flinch. She had made a promise to herself and to the town that she would not back down. Get ready, Arjun whispered, his voice low but steady. The resistance fighters held their breath, each one watching for the signal. Netravati's hand rested on the hilt of the small knife she had taken from her father's old collection. It was nothing compared to the soldiers' weapons, but it would be enough to defend herself. As the soldiers neared the ambush point, Netravati gave the signal. A single, sharp whistle split the air, and the resistance fighters sprang into action. The first wave of soldiers was caught off guard, their vehicles halted by barricades that had been set up along the road. The fighters emerged from their hiding places, launching a swift, coordinated attack. The sound of gunfire erupted, sharp and jarring in the stillness of the afternoon. Netravati's heart raced as she sprinted toward one of the soldiers who had taken cover behind a pile of crates. She didn't know what she was doing, only that she had to act. She lunged forward, her knife flashing in the dying light of the day, and in an instant, the soldier was on the ground. But there was no time to celebrate. The soldiers were regrouping, their numbers overwhelming the resistance's initial assault. The first wave of attackers had been repelled, but there were more soldiers behind them coming fast. Netravati's mind raced. The plan had been to delay the soldiers, but now it was a fight for survival. Arjun, Netravati shouted, her voice hoarse with urgency. We need to fall back. The others need more time. Arjun, who had been fighting beside her, nodded grimly. Fall back to the eastern ridge. We can't hold them here. Netravati's eyes met his, and for a moment, she saw a flicker of something: fear, respect, maybe even admiration. They were in this together, and they both knew what it meant. The resistance fighters began retreating, moving quickly and silently through the trees and over the uneven ground, but the soldiers were close on their heels. The battle was far from over, but Netravati knew they had bought the townspeople precious time. As they reached the ridge overlooking the town, Netravati paused for a moment, taking in the scene below. The town was still standing, but the soldiers were closing in, and their grip was tightening. Netravati could feel the weight of the town's future pressing down on her, the responsibility of every life now resting on her shoulders. "We can't stop now," she whispered to herself, steeling her resolve. "We fight until the end." And so, the first strike had been made. The resistance had held its ground, but the true battle was just beginning. Chapter 5. The heart of the storm the night after the skirmish was the longest Netravati had ever endured. The pain of the wounded, the fear of the soldiers closing in, and the weight of the responsibility that now rested on her shoulders all made sleep impossible. She had led the resistance into the first true battle, and though they had managed to slow the soldiers, the cost was high. A few fighters had fallen, and many others were injured, some critically. They had retreated to the safety of the forest's edge, but they were far from out of danger. Netravati moved silently through the makeshift camp, her eyes scanning the faces of the people who had chosen to follow her. They were tired, their faces marked with dirt and exhaustion. But there was something else in their eyes: resolve. They had fought, and they had won their first victory. But the storm was far from over. Arjun approached her quietly, his face shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. His weathered face bore the mark of a man who had seen too much, but his eyes were sharp, filled with a quiet wisdom. "You did well," Arjun said, his voice rough from the day's exertions. "But this isn't over. We've bought some time, but we need to be ready for what's coming next." Netravati nodded, trying to shake off the fatigue that clung to her like a heavy cloak. "How many did we lose?" "Too many," Arjun replied, his voice heavy with regret. "More than we should have. But there's no going back now. We need to get the wounded to safety, and we need to plan our next move." She looked over to the small group of injured fighters, their bodies tended to by the few who had some knowledge of healing. The sight of their suffering twisted something deep inside her. They had fought for a cause greater than themselves, and yet it felt like a never-ending cycle of pain and loss. The soldiers were relentless, and every victory they won seemed to come at a terrible price. "We'll get them to the caves," Netravati said firmly. "We can hold there until the others arrive. But we need more support, Arjun. We can't keep fighting like this." Arjun nodded, his face grim. "We'll send word to the other towns. But they're as scared as we are. They've seen what the soldiers can do. It's going to take more than hope to make them act." Netravati's gaze hardened. She couldn't afford to wait for others to act. If she was going to lead this rebellion, she needed to take control, not just of the soldiers, but of the hearts of those around her. "We'll make them act," Netravati said, her voice filled with quiet conviction. The soldiers might have their weapons, but we have something stronger: the will to fight, the will to live. As the days passed, the resistance regrouped, hiding the caves that dotted the mountainside. Netravati's plan was to strengthen their position, gather as many fighters as they could, and then strike back harder. It was a dangerous game. Each move, each decision could tip the balance one way or the other. She spent hours speaking with the injured, comforting those who had lost friends, and giving hope to those who had none left. But there were still difficult decisions ahead. The soldiers had already made it clear that they would stop at nothing to crush the resistance. Their numbers were growing, and the town was now an open target. Netravati knew that the time for guerrilla tactics and hidden attacks was coming to an end. They needed to confront the soldiers head-on or risk being destroyed. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the mountains in shades of purple and gold, Netravati stood on a high ridge, looking down at the town below. It was quiet now, but the soldiers were gathering their forces. It was only a matter of time before they made their move. We need to make a stand, Netravati murmured to herself, her heart pounding in her chest. We can't keep running. Not anymore. Arjun came up beside her, his steps silent. He had seen the same things in the distance, the gathering storm, the growing threat. He knew what she was thinking. It's too soon, Arjun warned. We don't have enough strength. Not yet. We don't have a choice, Netravati said, turning to face him. If we don't act now, we'll lose everything. The soldiers are too strong, and they'll crush us one by one. But if we strike at their heart, if we show them that we are not afraid, we might just give the others the Netravati to join us. Arjun studied her, his eyes calculating. You want to take the fight to them, don't you? Yes, Netravati said, her voice unwavering. We take their strongest position, their command center. If we destroy their supplies, their ability to communicate, we can weaken them enough to force them to retreat. But we'll need everyone. We need to rally every town, every village. We need to be united. There was silence for a long moment. The weight of her words hung in the air, and for the first time, Arjun seemed unsure. It was a risky plan, and the chances of success were slim. But Netravati had always been a force to be reckoned with, and there was no stopping her now. All right, Arjun finally said, his voice resigned but filled with respect. But we do it my way. We'll move at dawn. We strike hard, we strike fast, and we get out before they can retaliate. No more waiting. Netravati nodded, her heart beating faster with each passing moment. This was it, the turning point. If they succeeded, they would become more than just a group of rebels. They would become a movement. And if they failed, she didn't let herself think of failure. The next morning, just as the first light of dawn broke over the mountains, the resistance moved out. They were quiet, like shadows, moving swiftly through the woods toward the soldiers' command center. Netravati led the way, her eyes sharp, her heart set on the mission ahead. The soldiers wouldn't know what hit them. Chapter 6. The heart of darkness, the air was thick with tension as Netravati and her fighters neared the soldiers' command center. The first rays of sunlight barely pierced through the thick canopy of trees, casting long shadows over the forest floor. The quiet was suffocating, broken only by the sound of rustling leaves and the soft footfalls of the resistance fighters. They moved like phantoms, their faces grim and determined, knowing full well that this would be the most dangerous mission they had ever undertaken. Netravati's mind raced as she led the way, her every step deliberate, every breath measured. This was their chance, the moment that could either make or break the rebellion. If they succeeded, they would strike at the heart of the enemy and disrupt their control. But if they failed, the soldiers would retaliate with a vengeance, and the consequences would be dire. Arjun, take the east flank. We'll approach from the north, Netravati whispered, her voice barely audible above the sounds of the forest. Make sure no one escapes. We can't afford to leave any survivors. Arjun nodded, his eyes locking with hers for a brief moment before he disappeared into the trees with a handful of fighters. Netravati turned to the rest of the group, her voice steady despite the weight of what lay ahead. Remember the plan. We hit fast, we hit hard, and we don't linger. In and out. No mistakes. The group moved forward, their steps synchronized as they approached the enemy's stronghold. The command center was a heavily fortified building guarded by a mix of soldiers and watchtowers. It stood at the edge of the forest, a stark contrast to the surrounding wilderness. The soldiers had been smart in choosing their position. It was strategically placed, offering a clear view of the town and the surrounding area. But they hadn't counted on the resistance fighters or on Netravati's determination. As they reached the perimeter of the camp, Netravati held up her hand, signaling for everyone to stop. She crouched low, scanning the area through the dense foliage. Her heart thudded in her chest as she observed the guards moving lazily about, unaware of the approaching threat. This was the moment. They had to be silent, precise, and ruthless. On my signal, she whispered, her voice steady. Move. The seconds seemed to stretch into eternity. Netravati's eyes never left the command center, watching every movement, calculating their next steps. She could hear the muffled voices of the soldiers in the distance, the faint clinking of their gear as they went about their routines. The resistance had been training for this moment for weeks, and now it was time to put everything they had learned into action. She raised her hand, and the fighters moved as one. They darted from their hiding spots, swift and silent, slipping through the shadows as they made their way toward the command center. Netravati's heart pounded in her chest as she led the charge, her knife ready, her mind focused on the task at hand. The first guard fell silently, a swift strike to the throat cutting off any chance of a cry for help. One by one, the resistance fighters eliminated the soldiers on the perimeter, taking them down with deadly precision. Netravati's eyes never wavered, her gaze locked on the command center as they drew closer. They were almost there when a shout rang out, shattering the stillness of the morning air. Intruders! Alert! Intruders! The entire camp erupted into chaos. Netravati's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't hesitate. The element of surprise was gone, but they had no choice now. They had to finish what they started. Charge, she shouted, her voice cutting through thin. The resistance fighters surged forward, weapons raised, moving with the fury of a storm. The soldiers scrambled to respond, but they were unprepared for the ferocity of the attack. Netravati led the charge, her knife slashing through the air as she cut down one soldier after another. The air was thick with the stench of sweat and blood, the screams of the dying echoing in the chaos. But the soldiers were trained, and they fought back with equal ferocity. The resistance fighters were outnumbered, and the soldiers quickly began to rally, forming a defensive perimeter around the command center. Netravati's mind raced as she searched for a way to break through. They couldn't afford to be bogged down in a prolonged battle. They needed to cripple the soldiers' command structure, and that meant reaching the central building where the officers were stationed. Arjun. Netravati called, her voice barely audible above the chaos. "We need to take the building. Now." Arjun, who had been fighting on the east flank, nodded grimly and gestured for his fighters to follow. Together, they moved through the smoke and gunfire, pushing forward with all their might. Netravati could see the central building ahead, its walls lined with soldiers scrambling to defend their position. The path ahead was clear, but the soldiers were beginning to fortify their defenses, their fire growing more concentrated. Pushed through, Netravati shouted to her fighters, her voice a rallying cry in the midst of the chaos. They surged forward, making their way to the central building. As they reached the entrance, Netravati threw open the door, her heart pounding in her chest. Inside, the officers were huddled around a table, caught off guard by the sudden assault. Netravati didn't waste a second. She charged forward, her knife flashing as she struck down the first officer who attempted to draw his weapon. The remaining officers scrambled to defend themselves, but the resistance fighters were relentless. Netravati moved like a force of nature, cutting down anyone who got in her way. She could feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins, the fear and doubt buried beneath the rush of battle. With one final, decisive strike, Netravati took down the last officer, his body collapsing to the ground with a thud. The building fell silent, the chaos of the battle outside muted for a moment. Netravati stood in the center of the room, her chest heaving as she surveyed the aftermath of the assault. The command center was theirs, but the battle was far from over. "We've done it," Arjun said, his voice low but filled with a quiet sense of triumph. "We've struck at the heart of their operation." Netravati nodded, but her eyes remained sharp. The soldiers would retaliate, she knew that. But this was a victory. A small one, but a victory nonetheless. And it would send a message. The resistance had arrived, and they would not be silenced. Chapter 7. The price of victory. The silence in the command center was heavy, suffocating in its aftermath. The once lively hub of military operations now lay in ruins, the bodies of the soldiers scattered across the floor, some still warm, others cold in death. The resistance fighters stood around the room, catching their breath, bloodied but unbored. The smell of gunpowder and blood clung to the air, mingling with the scent of smoke that drifted in from the battlefield outside. Netravati stood at the center, her eyes scanning the room, her mind racing. They had struck hard, and the soldiers' command structure was in disarray, but the victory felt hollow. The battle had been costly, and she knew that this was only a temporary win. The soldiers would retaliate with a force greater than they had ever seen. But for now, they had bought themselves time, a few precious hours, perhaps even days, before the full force of the enemy descended upon them. Is everyone accounted for? Netravati asked, her voice steady despite the chaos that still roiled within her. Arjun, who had been checking on the other fighters, nodded. We've lost 5, he said, his voice thick with grief. They fought well, but we can't mourn yet. The soldiers will regroup, and we need to get out of here before they return in force. Netravati felt the weight of his words settle in her chest. 5 of her fighters, brave souls who had given everything for the cause. The cost of their fight was becoming all too clear. It was one thing to rally others to join the cause, but it was another to see the sacrifices they had to make. The weight of leadership pressed down on her, the responsibility of each life that was now in her hands. We move out, Netravati said, her voice cutting through the tension. We head to the mountains. It's our best chance. We can regroup, tend to the wounded, and prepare for what's coming. As the resistance fighters began to gather their things, readying themselves for the next phase of the mission, Netravati felt a sharp pang in her chest. She had been the one to lead them into battle, and now she would lead them out. The responsibility for their survival, for their future, was hers alone. And yet, despite the weight of it all, there was a spark of something else, determination, a fierce resolve that refused to die. They made their way through the forest, moving swiftly but cautiously, keeping to the shadows as much as possible. The soldiers would be on high alert now, and they couldn't afford to be discovered. They had no way of knowing how much time they had before reinforcements arrived, but every moment was precious. As they approached the mountain pass, Arjun pulled Netravati aside. We can't keep running forever, he said, his voice low. You know that, right? Sooner or later, we'll have to face them head on. We can't keep hiding in caves and forests. Netravati met his gaze, her eyes hard. I know, but this isn't the time. Not yet. We need to rebuild, gather more support. We can't afford to go into battle with what we have now. We need strength, more people, more resources. Arjun didn't argue. He knew that she was right, but there was a fire in his eyes, a hunger for the fight that matched her own. The resistance had struck a blow, but the war was far from over. As they reached the caves that would serve as their temporary refuge, Netravati felt the weight of their situation settle around her. They had accomplished something significant, but they had also made themselves a target. The soldiers would be relentless now, and the reprisals would be brutal. But the rebellion had taken root. There was no going back. That night, as the resistance fighters tended to their wounded and buried their dead, Netravati sat alone at the entrance of the cave, staring out into the night. The stars above seemed distant, unreachable, as if mocking her efforts. She had hoped that by striking at the heart of the enemy, she could give her people a chance to rise up, to take back what had been stolen from them. But now, the cost was clear. Every victory came with a price, and that price was often paid in blood. Arjun, Netravati said, her voice barely above a whisper as he sat beside her. What if we can't win this? What if it's all for nothing? Arjun didn't answer right away. He just sat next to her, staring out into the dark expanse of the forest. "We're not fighting for victory, Netravati," he said finally. "We're fighting for survival, for our right to exist. Even if we don't win, even if we fall, the world will know that we fought. And that will be enough." Netravati closed her eyes, letting his words sink in. She had always known that the fight would be difficult, that the path would be fraught with danger and loss. But hearing Arjun's words, hearing them so simply and sincerely, made her realize something important. It wasn't about the outcome. It wasn't about whether they won or lost in the end. It was about the struggle, the defiance, the refusal to bow to tyranny. They weren't fighting to win. They were fighting to live. The next morning, Netravati gathered the resistance fighters together. The wounds of the previous day were still fresh. The grief of their fallen comrades still raw, but the fire in their eyes was undeniable. "We faced our first real battle, and we've survived," Netravati began, her voice firm and clear. "But the road ahead is going to get harder. The soldiers won't stop until we are all dead or broken. We need to keep moving, keep fighting. This is our home. This is our future, and we will not let them take it from us." There was a murmur of agreement, a stirring of determination among the fighters. They had lost, but they hadn't lost everything. They still had each other, and they still had the will to fight. And in the end, that might be all they needed. Chapter 8. The storm within the days following their victory were a blur of movement and planning. Netravati had always known that the cost of resistance would be high, but now, with the weight of their loss hanging over her, it felt heavier than ever. 5 fighters had died in the assault on the command center, and several more were wounded, some gravely. The toll of the battle was apparent in the somber silence that clung to the camp as the fighters tended to their fallen comrades and nursed their wounds. Despite the grief, the momentum of their success could not be ignored. The soldiers would be coming for them, but the resistance had struck a blow that could not be undone. It was a spark in the dark, a symbol of defiance that would inspire others to rise up. But as Netravati looked around the cave at the faces of her people, she knew that the true battle was only just beginning. In the days that followed, the resistance gathered in the caves, their movements shadowed by the ever-present fear that the soldiers would track them down. Each moment of peace felt fleeting, like the calm before a storm. Netravati knew the enemy wouldn't take long to recover from their loss. And when they did, they would come at them with everything they had. Arjun came to her with a map, marking the location of a small town they could move through to gather more supplies. It was a dangerous mission, but they needed the provisions if they were to survive the coming onslaught. "We need to act quickly," Arjun said. "The longer we wait, the more vulnerable we become." Netravati nodded, her mind already working through the risks and contingencies. The town was only a few days' march away, but the roads were treacherous, and the soldiers were patrolling the area. They would have to move swiftly and silently, staying out of sight as much as possible. The town's inhabitants were likely sympathetic to their cause, but any sign of the resistance would bring the soldiers down on them with force. "We'll move at night," Netravati decided. "We need to get in, get what we need, and get out before the soldiers can react." Arjun gave her a wary look. And if the soldiers are already there, then we fight, Netravati said, her voice resolute. We fight and we survive. We don't have a choice. The plan was set into motion. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Netravati and a small group of resistance fighters slipped out of the caves, moving silently through the forest. The air was heavy with tension, each crack of a twig underfoot feeling like a betrayal. The soldiers could be anywhere, and the thought of being caught in the open filled Netravati with a sense of unease that she couldn't shake. The night passed slowly, and by the time they reached the outskirts of the town, the first hints of dawn were beginning to touch the sky. Netravati's heart raced as they took cover in the shadows, scanning the town's narrow streets. The town was eerily quiet, the buildings dark and still. It was as though the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for the storm to pass. Arjun, Netravati whispered, her voice tight with apprehension. You and the others move to the north side. I'll take the south. Arjun nodded, his face unreadable in the dim light. Be careful. You too, Netravati replied, watching as he and his group vanished into the shadows. Netravati moved through the town, her senses heightened. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the soft rustle of wind through the trees and the occasional distant sound of a dog barking. Her eyes flicked from window to window, from door to door, every corner potentially hiding a soldier or a spy. They couldn't afford to be seen. As she reached the town's central square, she stopped, crouching low behind a well. Her breath caught in her throat as she spotted a group of soldiers patrolling the area, their faces cold and expressionless. They moved in formation, clearly searching for something or someone. Her gut tightened. The soldiers were closer than she had anticipated. Netravati held her breath, watching as the patrol moved past, their footsteps heavy on the cobblestones. The moment they were out of sight, she exhaled slowly and signaled to her team. They needed to move fast. They made their way to the market district, hoping to find what they needed before the soldiers returned. The resistance fighters had gathered supplies from sympathetic townsfolk in the past, and the town's market was a hidden heaven for those in need. But today, the streets were deserted, the usual bustle replaced by an unsettling quiet. There, Arjun murmured, pointing to a small supply stall. Food, medicine, weapons. It's everything we need. Netravati nodded, her heart racing as they approached the stall. They quickly gathered what they could carry, dried rations, medicine, and a few weapons, and began to head back to the outskirts of town. But as they turned a corner, they were met with the sharp crack of a rifle being loaded. Before Netravati could react, a voice rang out from the shadows. Stop right there. Netravati's eyes darted to the source of the voice, an officer standing at the end of the street, flanked by two soldiers. His uniform was impeccable, his posture rigid with authority. He had them cornered. She could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. This was it. The soldiers had caught up with them. But even as the officer raised his weapon, Netravati's mind raced. There was no way out, no time to run. They had to fight. Drop your weapons, the officer commanded, his voice cold and calculating. Netravati's fingers tightened around her knife, her breath shallow. She knew they couldn't afford to show any weakness. "I don't think we'll be doing that," she said, her voice steady, though her heart was hammering in her chest. The officer's lips curled into a slight smirk, then prepared to die. But Netravati wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. With a sharp gesture, she signaled for her fighters to spread out, preparing for the fight of their lives. Chapter 9. The battle for tomorrow. The tension in the air was palpable, every heartbeat stretching the seconds into eternity. Netravati stood firm, the weight of her knife now a reassuring presence in her hand. The officer's smug smile only fueled the fire in her chest. They were cornered, yes, but not defeated. Not yet. She caught Arjun's eye for a fraction of a second, a silent exchange of trust and resolve. They had come this far, and they would fight for their survival. If this was the price they had to pay to secure a future, then they would face it head-on. The officer's gun raised, his finger tightening on the trigger. It all happened in a split second. Netravati lunged to the side, her body instinctively moving out of the line of fire. The soldiers reacted immediately, the street erupting in a chaotic blur of shouts, gunfire, and the sound of bodies hitting the ground. Arjun and the others weren't waiting for the officer's order. They were already moving, darting from shadow to shadow, returning fire with deadly precision. Netravati didn't hesitate. Her feet were already in motion, her mind calculating every move, every strike. The officer shouted, trying to regain control of the situation, but it was too late. The resistance fighters had the element of surprise, and they were determined to make it count. Netravati spotted one of the soldiers aiming at Arjun, and in a split-second decision, she hurled her knife with deadly accuracy. It buried itself into the soldier's chest, and he crumpled to the ground. Arjun shot her a quick, grateful nod before continuing the fight, moving through the alleyways with lethal grace. Netravati didn't have time to savor the kill. She had a battle to win, and every second counted. The officer was still barking orders, but the soldiers were scattered, caught in the chaos of their retreating positions. Netravati saw an opening, a gap in their defenses. Without hesitation, she charged toward it, her body a blur of motion. She ducked behind a barrel and then leaped over it, landing on a soldier who hadn't seen her coming. The man fell with a grunt, his weapon slipping from his hand as she disarmed him. Before he could recover, she knocked him out cold with a well-placed punch. Netravati's breath came in quick, shallow bursts. The adrenaline coursing through her veins made everything seem sharper, more vivid. But even as her body moved on instinct, her mind never stopped calculating, planning her next move. She saw the officer again, his eyes blazing with fury. He was struggling to regain control, but his soldiers were being picked off one by one. The resistance had the advantage, and they weren't about to let it slip away. "Fall back," the officer shouted, but it was too late. The resistance fighters were closing in, pushing the soldiers back with brutal efficiency. Netravati's gaze locked with the officers, and for a moment, time seemed to slow. There was no fear in her heart, only the cold certainty that this was a battle for survival. Not just hers, but for every person who had ever suffered under the boot of the soldiers. This wasn't just a fight for supplies. It was a fight for the future. With a quick motion, Netravati unsheathed her blade and charged. The officer saw her coming, his eyes widening in shock. He raised his rifle to fire, but before he could pull the trigger, Netravati was on him. She kicked the rifle out of his hand, sending it skittering across the cobblestones. In the heat of the moment, the officer's composure faltered. His arrogance, his belief in his own invincibility had made him reckless. He swung a fist at her, but she ducked under it, moving with a fluidity that betrayed her years of training. Before he could react, her blade was at his throat. He froze his eyes wide with shock and fear. "You'll regret this," he hissed, his voice strained with anger. "No," Netravati said, her voice cold and unwavering. "You'll regret underestimating us." With one swift motion, she struck, and the officer fell silent, his body crumpling to the ground. The battle was over. The soldiers had been defeated, their will shattered by the precision of the resistance's strike. Netravati stood over the fallen officer for a moment, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She wasn't celebrating. There was no victory dance, no loud proclamation of triumph. There was only the grim reality of the aftermath. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over, and the price of this victory had been steep. She looked up at Arjun, who was making his way toward her. His face was bloodied, but his eyes were filled with pride. "We did it," he said quietly, his voice hoarse. "We actually did it." Netravati nodded, her gaze sweeping over the fallen soldiers. "For now," she said, her voice low but resolute. "But this is just one battle in a much larger war." Arjun's expression darkened, but he didn't argue. He knew she was right. The soldiers would regroup, and they would come back stronger. But for now, they had taken something from the enemy. They had shown the world that they would not be silenced. As the resistance fighters gathered their fallen comrades and prepared to move out, Netravati paused for a moment, looking out over the town. The rising sun was casting a warm, golden glow over the streets, but it was a deceptive peace. They had won the day, but tomorrow was another battle, and Netravati was ready for it. Chapter 10. A faint hope. The aftermath of the battle felt like an uneasy lull in a storm, as though the very air was holding its breath. The dust had settled on the cobblestones, and the soldiers' bodies were being hastily dragged into a nearby alley. The resistance fighters were wounded, some gravely, but they had achieved something monumental. For the first time, they had struck a blow that could not be ignored. But the victory felt hollow. Netravati stood in the center of the square, her eyes scanning the faces of her comrades. They were alive. They had survived. But what now? Arjun approached her, his step slow but deliberate. His face was grim, his expression unreadable. "We need to keep moving," he said quietly, his voice laced with the weight of what had just occurred. "The soldiers will be back, and we can't afford to stay here." Netravati nodded, her mind already moving ahead. She had always known that each victory came at a cost, and today was no different. The bodies of their fallen comrades weighed heavily on her heart, but she couldn't afford to let grief consume her. Not yet. There was still work to be done. "We'll move west," she decided, her voice firm. "There's a hidden valley near the border where we can rest and regroup." It's off the main roads, so the soldiers won't think to look for us there. Arjun hesitated. It's risky. The roads are being watched, and we'll have to cross open terrain. If the soldiers catch our trail, they won't. Netravati interrupted, her voice resolute. We move at night, we cover our tracks, and we move swiftly. They won't catch us. The plan was set into motion. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the resistance fighters had gathered their belongings and set off, leaving behind the town and its haunting silence. As they moved through the dense forest, Netravati's thoughts remained focused, her mind constantly calculating their next steps. She knew that every moment spent on the road increased their vulnerability, but there was no choice. The soldiers were too close now. They had to disappear before it was too late. As they trekked through the wilderness, the weight of their losses pressed down on Netravati's chest. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the world itself was pushing back against them. And yet, through the darkened trees, there was a flicker of hope, a faint glimmer of light. They made camp in the heart of the forest, deep within the shadows of the trees. The air was cool, and the sounds of the night seemed to wrap around them like a protective shroud. Netravati sat by the fire, her eyes flickering between the flames and the faces of her comrades. They were exhausted, but they had made it through another day. For now, that was enough. We'll rest here for a few hours, she said softly, breaking the silence. Then we move out again. We can't afford to stay in one place for too long. Arjun nodded, but his face was etched with worry. How long do you think we can keep this up? Netravati's gaze hardened, her resolve steeling. As long as it takes. We fight because we have no other choice. If we don't, then what's left of this world will be lost. The words hung in the air like a challenge. But Netravati didn't expect an answer. Arjun understood. They all understood. They were fighting for survival, for the chance to reclaim a future that had been stolen from them. As the night stretched on, Netravati found herself alone in her thoughts. The faces of those they had lost flashed before her eyes, brave fighters who had given everything for the cause. She could still hear their voices, their laughter, and their stories. She could still feel their presence, as if they were all around her, urging her to keep going, to never give up. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the memories wash over her. The war was far from over, but there was a part of her that believed, no, knew that they could win. They had already proven that they could fight. And as long as they had hope, they had everything. The wind rustled through the trees, a soft reminder of the world outside their small, fragile camp. But even in the midst of all this uncertainty, Netravati found something that she hadn't expected: peace. It wasn't the peace of victory or certainty, but the peace that came from knowing they had done everything they could. They had fought back against the darkness, and they would keep fighting. Chapter 11. Shadows on the horizon. The days that followed were a blur of exhaustion and unrelenting vigilance. They had moved through the forests by night, resting only in the shadow of thick trees where the soldiers could not find them. The resistance fighters were growing weary, their bodies aching from the long marches and the constant fear that the soldiers would close in on them at any moment. But there was something else weighing on Netravati's minds, an uneasy feeling that seemed to follow them wherever they went. The small valley they had hoped would offer them rest was no sanctuary after all. It was hidden well, but the soldiers' reach was far, and as the days wore on, Netravati couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every rustling leaf, every shifting shadow seemed to signal danger. As they set up camp one evening, Netravati sat beside the fire, her eyes scanning the surrounding darkness. She had grown used to the silence of the forest, but tonight there was something different. A sense of unease clung to the air, like a storm on the horizon waiting to break. "Arjun," she said quietly, her voice carrying over the crackling flames, "have you noticed anything strange lately?" Arjun looked up from where he was sharpening his knife. His brow furrowed slightly, but he didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he glanced into the darkened woods. "I thought I heard something earlier," he said, his voice low. "Movement in the trees. Could have been an animal. Oh, or someone else," Netravati finished for him. She wasn't sure if it was just her instincts or something more, but the nagging feeling in her gut wouldn't go away. "I'll go check it out," Arjun said, rising from his spot. "You stay here. Keep the others quiet." Netravati didn't argue. She knew he was right. She needed to stay alert to keep the camp safe. As Arjun disappeared into the trees, she sat back against a rock, her senses heightened. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows on the ground, and for a moment, it felt as though the forest itself was closing in around her. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Just as she was about to call out for Arjun, he emerged from the darkness, his face set in grim lines. "It's worse than I thought," he said, his voice tinged with worry. "They're not far from here." Netravati's heart skipped a beat. "The soldiers?" Arjun nodded. "A patrol. They've been searching the area for days. They must have caught wind of our trail." "Damn it," Netravati muttered, standing up quickly. She turned to the rest of the group, her voice sharp. "Pack up. Now." There was no time to waste. They had to move, and fast. Arjun's words confirmed what she had feared. They were running out of time. The soldiers had finally caught up with them. As the camp was hurriedly packed, Netravati's thoughts raced. They had barely managed to survive the last encounter. If they were caught now, it could be the end of everything. The resistance, the hope they had fought for, it would all be lost. "Arjun, we need to make it to the next town," Netravati said, her voice firm despite the fear that gripped her chest. "We can't stay here. If we move quickly, we might make it before they can track us." But Arjun's face darkened. "The soldiers will be searching the roads. We'll have to move off the path again, through the hills. It's more dangerous, but it might be our only shot." Netravati met his gaze. She knew what he was saying was true. The open roads were too risky. They had to go off the beaten track through the rough, unfamiliar hills. It would slow them down, but it was their only chance. "Then we move," she said, her voice cold with resolve. "And we move fast." They packed up in silence, the weight of their decision pressing heavily on each of them. Every rustle of a leaf, every snap of a twig, felt like the soldiers were closing in around them. They had no choice but to keep moving forward, no matter the cost. By the time they reached the hills, the sun had set, leaving them with only the dim light of the moon to guide their way. The path was treacherous, the steep incline making every step feel like a battle. But they pushed forward, moving quickly, keeping their heads down. As they climbed higher, the air grew colder, the wind picking up, carrying with it the scent of rain. The storm Netravati had sensed earlier was coming, and it wouldn't be long before it reached them. "We need to find shelter," Arjun said, his breath visible in the chilly air. "If that storm hits, we'll be exposed." "I know," Netravati replied, her eyes scanning the terrain. "There's a cave up ahead. We can take cover there for the night." They made their way toward the cave, the storm beginning to gather strength behind them. The wind howled through the trees, the first raindrops splattering against the ground, and the temperature dropped even further. When they reached the cave, it was a welcome relief. The entrance was narrow, but it offered enough shelter to protect them from the worst of the storm. They settled inside, huddling together for warmth as the rain poured down in torrents outside. Netravati sat at the mouth of the cave, watching the storm rage through the night. The sound of the wind and rain was deafening, but it also brought a strange sense of calm. In the storm's fury, she found something that had been absent for too long, a reminder of how fragile they all were. The world outside was chaos, but in that cave there was peace. For a moment, she allowed herself to breathe, to let go of the fear that had been gnawing at her for so long. The storm outside would pass, as all storms did. But when it was over, the soldiers would still be out there, still hunting them, and they would have to fight again. Chapter 12. The storm within the storm raged through the night, its fury echoing off the rocky walls of the cave. The rain came in torrents, battering the earth outside, while the wind howled, as though the world itself was being torn apart. Inside the cave, however, there was only the quiet hiss of the fire they had built, casting flickering shadows against the stone. Netravati sat with her back against the wall, her eyes fixed on the flames. She wasn't tired, not really, but the exhaustion from the past days had seeped into her bones. The weight of her responsibility, of each decision she had made, sat heavily on her shoulders. She had always been strong, had always known how to move forward. But in the solitude of the cave, the enormity of their struggle seemed overwhelming. Arjun had fallen into a restless sleep, his face etched with exhaustion. His breathing was shallow, and his body was tense, as if he were waiting for something, waiting for the next attack, the next crisis. Netravati could see the toll this war was taking on him, on all of them. "Netravati," a soft voice broke through her thoughts, pulling her from her reverie. It was Leela, one of the younger fighters. She was sitting across from her, fiddling with a scrap of cloth, her hands moving mechanically as though trying to distract herself from the reality of their situation. "Do you ever wonder if we're doing the right thing?" The question hung in the air, heavy with the uncertainty they all felt. Netravati didn't answer immediately, instead letting the sound of the storm outside fill the silence between them. Leela continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I mean, we're fighting. But sometimes I feel like we're just running away from something we can't escape. Like the world is too broken, too far gone for us to fix." Netravati's gaze softened. She understood. She had asked herself that same question countless times. I don't know if we can fix the world, Leela, she said quietly. I don't know if we can even save ourselves. But what I do know is that if we stop fighting, if we let them win, then everything we've fought for, the lives we've lost, the people we've lost, will have been in vain. That's why we keep moving forward. Not because we know we'll win, but because we can't afford to lose. Leela looked at her for a long moment, as though searching for some sign of comfort, of reassurance. But Netravati didn't offer any false promises. There was no certainty in this fight, only the grim reality that they had no other choice but to keep going. I don't want to lose, Leela finally said, her voice trembling slightly. But sometimes I feel like we're not just fighting the soldiers, we're fighting ourselves. We're all so broken, Netravati. How do you keep going when it feels like we're running out of hope? Netravati sighed, her gaze moving to the cave's entrance, where the storm continued to rage. She knew exactly how Leela felt. The darkness, the uncertainty, it crept into the heart like an insidious poison. It made every step feel heavier, every victory seem insignificant. But the alternative was far worse. I keep going, Netravati said softly, because there's always a chance. Even when things seem darkest, there's always a glimmer of light. You just have to be willing to see it. Leela nodded slowly, but there was still a doubt in her eyes, a shadow of fear that had yet to be erased. Netravati knew it wasn't something she could simply fix with words. The weight of their struggle was something they all had to bear, and there was no quick solution, no easy escape. For a long while, the two of them sat in silence, listening to the storm. Eventually, the fire began to die down, and the warmth it provided faded into the cool air of the cave. Netravati glanced at Arjun, still asleep, his face pale and drawing. Her mind wandered back to the resistance's fight. They had already lost so much, so many lives, so many dreams shattered by the oppressive forces they fought against. And yet, they had kept going. She had kept going. Netravati, Arjun's voice cut through the silence, pulling her from her thoughts. He stirred, rubbing his eyes and sitting up. What's the plan for tomorrow? Netravati looked at him, her expression unreadable. They couldn't afford to stay here long. The soldiers would eventually find them, even in the wilderness. But they had to rest, to recover, to make sure they were ready for whatever came next. We move at dawn, she said firmly. We head north. There's a small village along the border. We'll be able to hide there for a while. Arjun nodded, his expression hardening with resolve. How long do you think we can stay ahead of them? As long as we stay smart, Netravati replied. As long as we keep moving. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, though the sense of foreboding never quite left. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the cave, there was a strange, fragile peace. It wasn't comfort. It wasn't safety. But it was a moment of reprieve. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, Netravati stood, stretching her stiff muscles. The time to move had come. The storm outside had passed, but the war was far from over. She glanced back at the sleeping fighters, Arjun, Leela, and the others, each of them carrying their own burdens, their own doubts. But they had made it through the night. They had survived. And that was enough for now. Chapter 13. Into the fire the morning light was weak, filtered through thick clouds that still carried the remnants of the storm. It was cold, and the air had that crispness that came with a world washed clean, but the tension remained. The remnants of the battle, the bodies of their fallen comrades, the uncertainty of what lay ahead, they clung to Netravati like a shadow that refused to dissipate. The group moved quickly, gathering their things and preparing for the long trek ahead. Every movement felt calculated, deliberate. They had no time to waste. Netravati walked at the front, her gaze scanning the path ahead. The hills were steep, the terrain unforgiving, but it was the only way they could avoid the main roads, the one place the soldiers were certain to be patrolling. It wasn't ideal, but it was all they had. "We can't linger here long," Arjun said as he walked alongside her. His voice was steady, but there was a worry in his eyes that Netravati couldn't ignore. "I know," she replied, her tone firm. "We'll keep moving, stay low, and get to the village by evening. It'll be tight, but we'll make it." "Do you really think the village is safe?" Arjun asked, his brow furrowing as he glanced up at the grey sky. "After everything that's happened, I don't know how much longer we can hide." Netravati's jaw tightened. He was right to question her. She had no way of knowing for sure if the village would offer them sanctuary. But there was no other choice. They couldn't just stop, couldn't stay where they were. They had to keep moving forward. "It's our best shot," she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "We've been staying ahead of them for weeks now. We just have to stay smart." They moved through the hills in silence, the wind picking up as the clouds grew darker. It was as if the world itself was conspiring against them. The path was difficult, narrow, and overgrown, but it allowed them to remain hidden, out of sight of the soldiers who would surely be searching the main roads. As they neared the base of the mountains, the terrain grew even rougher. The path became almost impassable in some places, and Netravati knew that their progress would slow. But they couldn't afford to stop. "Arjun, take the lead," she said, her voice low but urgent. "I'll bring up the rear. We need to keep watch on both sides." Arjun nodded without question, immediately taking his place at the front of the group. Netravati fell into step behind him, her senses alert. The others followed, moving as quickly as the uneven terrain would allow. It wasn't long before they came across a small stream that cut through the mountain pass. The water was running fast, churning over rocks and debris. Its sound loud enough to drown out any footsteps. Netravati paused for a moment, her hand on the hilt of a sword, eyes scanning the surroundings. "Get across quickly," she said to the group. "We'll stop on the other side to regroup." One by one, they crossed the stream, slipping and sliding over the slick rocks. The chill of the water was sharp against their legs, and their progress slowed as they struggled to maintain their balance. But they made it across without incident, and after a few moments of catching their breath, they continued onward. The day wore on, and the closer they got to the village, the more Netravati felt a gnawing unease in her chest. She had always trusted her instincts, but something was wrong. The air seemed thick, heavy with the weight of impending danger. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking straight into a trap. "Something's not right," she muttered under her breath as she moved alongside Arjun. What do you mean? He asked, his voice low. Just a feeling, she said, glancing back at the group. Keep your eyes open. We can't afford any surprises. They pushed forward, their pace quickening as the sun began to dip lower in the sky. The village was just beyond the next hill, but as they crested the rise, Netravati froze. Ahead of them, the village was eerily quiet. There was no sound of children playing, no smoke rising from chimneys, no animals in the fields. The houses stood in perfect, ominous stillness, their doors ajar as if abandoned. Arjun, Netravati whispered, her voice tight with fear. Something's happened. This doesn't look right. Arjun took a step forward, his hand on the hilt of his blade. Stay close. We'll approach cautiously. The group moved in a tight formation, weapons drawn, every step deliberate. As they neared the first house, the door swung open with a creak, revealing an empty interior. Dust had settled over the furniture, untouched for days. It was as if the villagers had simply disappeared. Check the barns, Netravati ordered, her voice hard with the realization that they weren't just walking into a sanctuary. We need to find out where everyone went. The fighters spread out, moving through the village with tense caution. Netravati's heart pounded in her chest. Something was terribly wrong. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of what had happened. Could it be that the soldiers had already been here? Or worse, had the villagers turned on them? Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as they searched. The barns were empty, the fields abandoned, and the wells were dry. There were no signs of struggle, but no signs of life either. And then, as Netravati rounded the corner of the last house, she heard it. A sound that stopped her dead in her tracks. A single shot echoed through the village, followed by the unmistakable sound of boots hitting the ground. The soldiers were here. Netravati's heart sunk as she realized the truth. This village was never meant to be a sanctuary. It was a trap. Move, she shouted, her voice cutting through the stillness. They turned, running for cover, but it was too late. The soldiers had already surrounded the village. Chapter 14. The price of defiance. The village, once a glimmer of hope, had now become a death trap. Netravati's heart pounded as she sprinted toward the narrow alley between two buildings, her mind racing for a plan. She had to think fast. There was no time to waste. Arjun, Leela, she shouted, her voice breaking through the chaos. Take the left side. Get to the trees. Arjun, his face a mask of determination, nodded and motioned for Leela to follow him. The others, too, understood without question, slipping into the shadows, their movements swift and precise. Netravati kept moving, pushing forward, every step bringing her closer to the trees on the outskirts of the village. But the soldiers were closing in, their boots echoing through the streets as they spread out, looking for any sign of resistance. Netravati's grip on her sword tightened. She couldn't afford to be caught. Not now. Not when they had come so far. As she ducked into the shadows, a familiar voice shouted from behind her. There they are. It was too late to hide now. The soldiers had spotted them. Run! Netravati yelled, her voice full of urgency as she turned to Arjun and Leela. Go! Get to the woods. The three of them broke into a full sprint, their legs pumping as fast as they could go. The sound of soldiers chasing them grew louder with each passing second. Netravati's breath came in short bursts as she pushed herself harder, the trees just within reach. A shot rang out, and for a moment, time seemed to slow. Netravati felt a sharp pain in her side, a burning sensation that spread through her body, and then darkness. She collapsed to the ground, her vision blurring, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She couldn't focus, couldn't move, but she could hear the frantic shouts of Arjun and Leela as they skidded to a halt beside her. Arjun, Leela, she gasped, barely able to speak. Arjun, help her. Leela's voice was frantic, and Netravati could hear her kneeling beside her, her hands desperately pressing against the wound. Arjun, get the others. We need to move her. Leela continued, her voice shaking with fear. But Arjun was frozen. His face was pale, his hands trembling as he looked down at Netravati, unable to speak. Netravati, he whispered, his voice hoarse. Please, you can't. Just go. Netravati breathed, her voice barely audible. Don't stop. Keep fighting. Keep going. The words were almost too much for her to say. She could feel the darkness creeping in at the edges of her consciousness, the weight of it pulling her down. But she couldn't let them stay. They had to survive. They had to keep going. Arjun. Netravati's voice cracked as she forced herself to focus on him. Promise me, you'll keep fighting. For all of us. Arjun's eyes were full of pain, full of unshed tears. But he nodded, his face set in grim determination. I promise, he whispered. I won't stop. I'll make sure they don't die in vain. The world around her seemed to blur, the sound of soldiers approaching growing louder. But she couldn't hold on anymore. The weight of her injuries, the exhaustion, the pain, it was too much. With one final breath, Netravati let herself drift into unconsciousness. Underscore 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 underscore. When Netravati finally regained consciousness, the world around her was eerily quiet. The pain in her side was still sharp, but it was distant, almost as though it belonged to someone else. Her eyes fluttered open, and she found herself lying the brush at the edge of the woods. Netravati, you're awake, a familiar voice said, filled with relief. It was Arjun, his face hovering over her as he gently touched her shoulder. Did we make it? Netravati asked, her voice rough. Arjun's expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something dark, something haunted. We are alive, he said quietly. But not everyone made it. Netravati's heart sunk as the truth of his words settled over her. She didn't need to ask who had fallen. The image of their desperate sprint, of the soldiers closing in, flashed before her eyes. They had lost people. She knew that much. How bad is it? She asked, struggling to sit up. We're a long way from safe, Arjun replied. But we're not alone. We've got a few survivors, and we've managed to hide for now. The soldiers are still looking for us, but they don't know we're here. Netravati nodded, her mind trying to focus on the immediate task. They had to keep moving, had to keep surviving. But the weight of the loss was already settling in, and she knew it would stay with them for a long time. "Where's Leela?" Netravati asked, her voice faint. "She's fine. She's helping with the others," Arjun replied. "You just need to rest. You've been through enough." Netravati nodded, but the thought of resting seemed impossible. She couldn't afford to. Not when the soldiers were still out there. Not when the fight wasn't over. "I'll rest when the war is over," she whispered, closing her eyes for a moment, even though her body screamed for relief. Arjun didn't respond. He didn't have to. They both knew that their battle was far from over. And that was the truth of it. Even if the storm had passed, even if they had survived another day, the price of defiance was high. Every step they took forward felt like a struggle, and the sacrifices made along the way would never be forgotten. But for Netravati, there was no other path. The fight had to continue, no matter the cost. Chapter 15. The burden of leadership. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth as Netravati lay back against the trunk of a tree, her body aching from the wound in her side. The others were gathering around the campfire, their faces grim, their bodies tense with the awareness that their fight was far from over. Arjun sat beside her, his eyes scanning the darkened forest. His fingers absent-mindedly traced the hilt of his sword, as if the motion offered him some small semblance of comfort. He had become quieter since the battle at the village. The loss of their comrades weighed heavily on him, and Netravati could see it in the way his shoulders slumped, in the tightness of his jaw. "Do you think we'll ever be free?" Arjun's voice broke the silence, soft but filled with a depth of emotion that surprised Netravati. She glanced at him, seeing the pain in his eyes, the same pain she felt in her own heart. "We're as free as we let ourselves be," she said quietly. "But freedom isn't a gift. It's something you take, something you fight for. It's a battle every single day." Arjun's gaze hardened, and for a moment, he was quiet again, the weight of her words sinking in. "I don't know if I can keep doing this," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "We've lost so much already. How much more can we take before it all falls apart?" Netravati understood his doubt. She could see it in the others as well. They were all feeling the strain, the endless run, the fear, the constant battle for survival. It was easy to question the purpose of it all, to wonder whether the price was worth the cost. "We keep going," Netravati said with quiet resolve, pushing herself up from the ground despite the sharp pain in her side. "Because if we stop, they win. And if we stop, everything we've lost will be for nothing." Arjun nodded slowly, though his eyes were still clouded with uncertainty. But he didn't argue. He knew she was right. The rest of the group had gathered around the fire, and now they looked to Netravati as their leader. Her eyes scanned each of them. Leela, still as fierce and sharp as ever. Rohan, his face always masked in calm stoicism. And the others, whose names were etched into her mind, though their faces sometimes blurred together in the chaos. She could feel the weight of their expectations, the burden of leadership settling heavily on her shoulders. She had never asked for this role, never wanted it. But somehow, it had become hers. And now, more than ever, the responsibility was becoming unbearable. "You're the one who's kept us going this far," Leela said, her voice breaking through Netravati's thoughts. Don't doubt yourself now. Netravati glanced at her, offering a faint smile. I'm not doubting myself, she said softly. But I am beginning to wonder how long I can keep this up. The path we're on, it's leading us into deeper darkness. And I don't know if I can always be the one to pull us out. Rohan spoke next, his voice low and steady, as always. You don't have to do it alone, Netravati. We are all in this together. The weight of leadership may be heavy, but it's not yours to carry by yourself. We're with you, all of us. The sincerity in his words cut through the storm inside her, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Netravati allowed herself to relax, just for a moment. She could feel the truth in Rohan's words. The others depended on her, yes, but she also depended on them. She wasn't alone in this fight. Not yet. We can make it through, Netravati said, more to herself than to anyone else. But we have to stick together. We have to trust each other. Leela nodded. We'll trust you, but you have to trust us too. For a long moment, the group sat in silence, the crackle of the fire filling the space between them. Netravati's thoughts swirled, her mind racing through countless possibilities, each one darker than the last. But she knew one thing for certain. They had come this far and they wouldn't stop now. We leave at first light, Netravati said, her voice strong, her resolve firm. We move east. They're a small village near the border, our best chance at resupply. And then, we keep moving. We won't stop until we find a way to end this. The others nodded in agreement, their faces set with determination. There was no turning back now. They had already crossed too many lines, sacrificed too much to give up. Get some rest, Netravati said, settling herself down against the trunk of the tree once more. Tomorrow will be a long day. As the group settled down for the night, the fire flickering in the quiet dark, Netravati lay still, staring up at the stars. Somewhere, beyond the endless forest, beyond the mountains, was the promise of peace. But how much more would they have to sacrifice to reach it? And would there be anyone left to see it through? Her thoughts drifted back to the village, to the faces of those they had lost. Every death was a reminder, every sacrifice a toll on her soul. But the fire within her, the fire that had driven her from the beginning, still burned bright. And it was that fire that would lead them through the darkest of nights. They had already lost so much. But Netravati couldn't let them lose everything. Chapter 16. The border, the morning air was crisp, the scent of pine trees filling their lungs as the group moved silently through the dense forest. Netravati's side throbbed with every step, but she pushed it aside. The pain had become a familiar companion, a constant reminder of what was at stake. They had made it this far, and now there was no turning back. Arjun walked ahead, his posture alert, his eyes scanning the path for any signs of danger. Netravati could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand hovered near his sword. Despite the quiet, every shadow seemed like a threat, every rustling leaf an omen of something worse to come. They had been traveling for hours, and the first rays of the sun began to filter through the trees, casting a golden glow over the group. Netravati was beginning to feel the weight of the journey. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion, It was the mental strain, the constant awareness that danger was always just a breath away. "We are close," Rohan murmured from behind her. He had been following silently, as always, but his calm presence was a source of quiet strength. "The border should be just beyond the next ridge." Netravati nodded, her eyes narrowing as she looked ahead. There, through the trees, she could just make out the faint outline of the ridge. It was their destination, a place that could offer them some semblance of safety, if only for a short while. But even as she saw the ridge, she felt a growing sense of unease. They had been traveling for so long, hiding from the soldiers, always on the run. The fear that had once been a sharp, immediate threat had now become a constant background hum, a reminder that there was always someone watching, always someone hunting them. As they approached the ridge, Netravati motioned for them to slow down. The rustling of leaves underfoot, the only sound breaking the silence. She signaled to Arjun, and the group spread out, moving quietly toward the top of the ridge. The last thing they needed was to be spotted before they could find shelter. At the top, they paused, their eyes scanning the area. Below them, the border stretched out, a wide expanse of open land that led to a small village. It was a border town, one that had long been a neutral zone, caught between the opposing forces, and it was there that they hoped to find resupply and rest. But the scene before them was far from peaceful. The village, once a quiet haven, was now heavily guarded. Soldiers patrolled the perimeter, their presence a stark reminder of how dangerous the world had become. Netravati's stomach churned as she took in the sight. They couldn't just walk into that village. Not without risking everything. "We can't go in like this," Netravati said, her voice low. "We'll be spotted immediately." "We'll have to find another way," Leela said, her eyes scanning the area for an alternative path. "There's a creek to the east. If we follow it, we might be able to slip past the guards." Netravati's mind raced as she considered their options. They couldn't afford to make a mistake. If they were caught now, it would all be over. "We go east. Then," she said, her voice firm, "stay close. Don't make a sound." The group nodded in unison, and with that, they began their descent down the ridge, careful to keep to the trees and underbrush. The sounds of the soldiers' movements grew louder as they neared the village, but the creek lay just ahead, offering them a chance to slip past unnoticed. Netravati could feel her heart pounding in her chest, the adrenaline pushing her forward. They had made it this far. They couldn't stop now. As they reached the creek, Netravati paused, looking back at the village one last time. The soldiers were still patrolling, unaware of their presence. But the danger was far from over. They had to stay hidden, stay quiet. One wrong move, and it could all come crashing down. "We cross here," she whispered, motioning to the creek, "and stay in the woods. We won't stop until we are out of sight." The others followed her lead, stepping carefully into the cold water, the sound of the creek masking their movements. They waded across, their feet slipping on the smooth stones, but they made it to the other side without incident. Netravati took a deep breath, feeling the tension in her shoulders begin to ease as they left the village behind. They weren't safe yet, but they were one step closer. "We've got a long way to go," Netravati said, her voice resolute. But we can do this. We just have to stay together. As they continued their journey through the woods, the shadows growing longer as the sun dipped lower in the sky, Netravati allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. She thought of the others who had fallen, the people they had lost along the way. And she thought of the road ahead, the uncertain future that awaited them. But despite the fear, despite the uncertainty, Netravati knew one thing for sure. They would keep fighting. And they would do it together. Chapter 17. The price of trust. The evening sky was streaked with the fading colors of twilight. As the group pushed onward, their steps quiet but determined through the dense woods. The exhaustion from their journey hung heavily on each of them. Yet there was a shared sense of urgency in the air, as if the fleeting seconds might mean the difference between survival and capture. Netravati glanced over her shoulder, making sure everyone was still with her. They were traveling at a steady pace, though it was clear that their supplies were running low. Her wound, while not fatal, had begun to ache more with each movement. The blood loss had weakened her, but she refused to show any sign of vulnerability. They were relying on her now, and she couldn't afford to falter. Arjun and Leela led the way, their eyes sharp and their movements swift. Rohan brought up the rear, always the watchful sentinel, ever aware of the smallest sound or shift in the air. Though the woods were quiet, they all knew that silence was their best ally. Any noise might alert enemy patrols, and they couldn't afford to be discovered. After several more hours of travel, they reached a small clearing by a stream. The water trickled gently over the rocks, its soothing sound a contrast to the tension in the air. Netravati signaled for them to stop, her body aching for rest. "We'll camp here for the night," she said quietly. Just enough time to rest and reassess. The group settled into the clearing, each of them falling into their familiar roles. Rohan moved to set up the perimeter, ensuring they had an escape route if necessary. Leela and Arjun worked quickly to gather firewood, and Netravati, though tired, checked their remaining supplies. Only enough food for one more day, Arjun said, his voice low as he approached her, a frown on his face. Netravati nodded, but she said nothing. They had all known this moment was coming. The journey was taking its toll, and now they had to make hard decisions. Every day, they fought not only against the enemy, but against the environment, their hunger, their fatigue, and the fear that gripped them all. "We'll need to get to the next town soon," Netravati said, looking up from the map she had spread out before her. "There's a chance we can find some supplies there, maybe even allies. Or more soldiers," Leela added with a grim smile. "We can't forget what happened last time." "I know," Netravati said, her voice heavy. "But we don't have a choice. We need food. We need information. And we need to find a way to keep moving forward." The others fell silent, each of them lost in their thoughts. The reality of their situation was harsh, and there was no easy path ahead. But they were survivors, all of them. They had made it this far, and that meant something. It meant that they had strength, that they had each other. After a quiet meal, the group gathered around the small fire. The flames flickered in the darkness, casting long shadows over their faces. Netravati stared into the fire, lost in thought. Every time they stopped like this, the risk grew. The risk of being discovered, of being found. But they couldn't keep running forever. We'll rest here for the night, Netravati said finally, breaking the silence. But we need to keep moving at dawn. Stay vigilant. Arjun nodded, his eyes weary but resolute. We'll be ready. As the fire crackled and the group settled in for the night, Netravati couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing. They were nearing the edge of the world they had known, and the choices ahead of them would be more difficult than ever before. In the darkness, she felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned, startled, to find Arjun standing beside her. Netravati, his voice was hesitant, as if he were unsure of how to proceed. What is it, Arjun? She asked softly, her voice steady despite the exhaustion creeping through her bones. He seemed to struggle with his words and then sighed. I just want you to know that we're all here. I know you've been carrying the weight of this mission on your shoulders, but you don't have to do it alone. We're with you, always. Netravati stared at him, surprised by the raw sincerity in his words. For a moment, the world seemed to stop, the fire flickering between them, the sounds of the forest still in the background. I know, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. But sometimes it feels like I have to do it alone. Like the burden of this, of everything we've lost. It's too much. Arjun knelt beside her, his eyes filled with understanding. It's not your fault. None of it is. But you don't have to carry it all by yourself. We're your family now, Netravati, and we'll carry it with you. She took a deep breath, the weight in her chest loosening just a fraction. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel something more than the endless battle, more than the responsibility. She allowed herself to feel gratitude. Thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Arjun gave her a small, reassuring smile, then stood up. We'll keep fighting. We'll win. As the night wore on and the fire burned low, Netravati thought about the price of trust. She had come to rely on Arjun, on Leela, on Rohan, and the others. They had become more than just comrades. They had become her family. And in them, she had found a strength she hadn't known she needed. But trust, she knew, was fragile. It was easy to give, but much harder to protect. The path ahead would test that trust. And in the end, they would have to decide if it was enough to carry them through the worst of it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new risks. But for tonight, they had each other. And that was something she could hold on to, at least for a little while. Chapter 18. The unexpected betrayal. The night passed quietly, though the air felt thick with the anticipation of what was to come. Netravati lay awake, her thoughts swirling in the darkness. She couldn't escape the gnawing feeling that something was wrong, an unsettling sense that danger was drawing closer, like a shadow creeping up behind them, silent and unseen. The first rays of dawn filtered through the trees, and the group was already stirring. They gathered their things, each of them moving through the familiar motions of preparing for the day's journey. Despite the quiet, there was a tension in the air, as if everyone knew that the next steps they took could lead to either safety or disaster. Netravati stood at the edge of the clearing, gazing out at the distant ridge that loomed in the distance. It was the only way forward, the next step in their long and arduous journey. But even as she prepared to lead the group onward, her mind remained unsettled. Are we ready? she asked, turning to face the others. Her voice was calm, but the concern in her eyes was palpable. Arjun nodded, his face hardening with resolve. We're ready. We'll keep moving east, Netravati continued. We can't afford to linger here. The closer we get to the next village, the more we'll have to worry about patrols. We'll have to stay off the main roads and keep to the woods. Leela, ever the strategist, spoke next. The soldiers will be on the lookout. We'll need to move fast and stay in the shadows. Rohan, who had been silent until now, added, we'll need to stay alert. The last thing we want is to run into a patrol when we're this close. Netravati nodded, feeling the familiar weight of leadership settle in her chest. They had done this 1,000 times before, but something about today felt different. The path ahead was unknown, and the price of failure seemed higher than ever. The group set out without further delay, their movements swift and purposeful. They traveled through the woods, the thick trees offering them some cover, though the ever-present threat of discovery loomed over them. The morning passed slowly, the hours dragging on as they pushed deeper into enemy territory. As they neared a narrow pass between two mountains, a sense of unease washed over Netravati. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was as if the forest itself had become too quiet, the birds no longer singing, the wind no longer rustling the leaves. It was a silence that felt wrong, a silence that spoke of danger. I don't like this, Netravati muttered under her breath, her hand instinctively brushing the hilt of her sword. What do you mean? Arjun asked, glancing back at her with a concerned look. Something's off, she replied, her voice low. Stay alert. They continued forward, each step feeling heavier than the last. As they rounded the bend in the path, they were met with an unexpected sight, an ambush. Soldiers, hidden in the trees, emerged suddenly, surrounding them in an instant. The unmistakable sound of steel scraping against metal filled the air, and Netravati's heart skipped a beat. Move, she shouted, drawing her sword in a fluid motion, but it was too late. The soldiers closed in around them, their weapons raised, their faces hidden behind the visors of their helmets. Netravati's mind raced as she scanned the situation. They were outnumbered and outgunned, and the forest offered little in the way of defense. They had no choice but to fight for their lives, for their mission, for everything they had lost. But then, just as the first soldier lunged toward her, something caught her eye. Someone among the soldiers, standing at the back of the group, his face familiar. Her breath caught in her throat as the realization struck. It was Jared. Her mind reeled as she saw him there, his expression cold and distant. Jared, a former ally. He had been one of them, their friend, their comrade. He had fought alongside them in the earlier battles. But now, he stood with the enemy, his sword raised, his eyes devoid of any recognition. No, Jared, Netravati shouted, her voice cracking with disbelief. What are you doing? Why? He didn't respond immediately, but when he did, his voice was low and filled with a chilling calmness. You should have known this was coming, Netravati, Jared said, his words sending a shiver down her spine. The world has changed, and you're too blinded by your ideals to see it. Her heart pounded in her chest as she looked at him, trying to understand what had happened. Jared, the man who had once shared their dreams, their hopes. How could he betray them? Why? She asked again, her voice barely more than a whisper. Jarita's lips twisted into a cold smile. Survival, Netravati. It's always about survival. And the only way to survive now is to align with the winning side. Netravati's stomach churned. She had never thought Jared capable of this kind of betrayal. He had always been their staunchest supporter, their strongest fighter. What had changed him? What had pushed him to this point? Get out of the way, Jared. Arjun shouted, his hand on his sword. This isn't you. Jareta's gaze flicked toward Arjun, and for a brief moment, there was a flicker of something, perhaps regret, perhaps guilt. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the same steely resolve that now marked his every action. Move aside, Arjun, Jared said coldly, or I'll have to do it the hard way. The tension in the air thickened, and Netravati's mind raced. The betrayal stung more than she cared to admit, and it was clear now that there was no turning back. Jared had made his choice. He was no longer part of their fight. We don't want to fight you, Netravati said, her voice steady despite the turmoil within her. But if you're with them, then you're our enemy now. Jareta's eyes flickered with something like sorrow, but it was quickly masked. There's no room for sentiment in this world, Netravati. Not anymore. With those words, the confrontation began. The clash of swords rang through the trees as the two sides met. Netravati fought with everything she had, her mind focused on survival. But a part of her couldn't stop thinking of Jared, the friend who had once stood beside them, now standing against them. And as the battle raged on, the question lingered in her mind. How much had they all truly changed? How much had the world forced them to betray their own? Chapter 19. The shattered trust. The battle unfolded quickly, the air thick with the sounds of clashing swords, shouts, and the steady rhythm of breaths from the fighters. Netravati's mind was a whirlpool of emotions, anger, betrayal, and a sharp, painful sadness. She had never expected Jared to turn on them. He had been a part of their family, their fight. But now, as he faced her with his sword raised against them, all that was left was an enemy. Netravati's heart hammered in her chest as she parried a blow from one of the soldiers, the sharpness of the steel against her blade reverberating up her arm. Her eyes stayed locked on Jared, who was now engaged in combat with Arjun. Their swords clashed in a desperate struggle, sparks flying with every strike. Jared, Netravati called out, trying to break through the noise. Why are you doing this? We trusted you. For a fleeting moment, Jareta's eyes met hers. There was a flicker of hesitation in them, a brief softness that made her believe, for just an instant, that he might still be the man she had known. But that moment was fleeting. His gaze hardened, and without a word, he launched another attack, pushing Arjun back. Get out of the way, Netravati, Arjun shouted, narrowly dodging a slash from Jared. Netravati hesitated, her heart torn. She didn't want to fight him, didn't want to believe that he was truly lost to them. But the reality was inescapable. He was no longer the man she had once fought beside. Her eyes darted around the battlefield. Rohan was holding his ground, but it was clear he was outnumbered. Leela, too, was engaged with the soldiers, her agility keeping her just one step ahead. But the tension was palpable. They were losing ground. A soldier lunged at Netravati from behind, and she barely had time to react before her instincts took over. She spun, deflecting the blow and delivering a swift strike that sent the soldier stumbling back. Her breath was ragged now, the fatigue from the fight and the weight of her thoughts pressing down on her. As the battle raged on, her mind kept returning to Jaret. She had to understand. Why? What had caused him to betray them? Was it fear? Was it power? Or was it something deeper, something that had always been there, waiting to break through? Arjun. Netravati shouted, her voice hoarse. We need to fall back. But Arjun was already engaged with Jaret again, their swords clashing with a force that made the air vibrate. Netravati's gaze flicked to Rohan and Leela. They were in danger of being overwhelmed. The enemy soldiers were pushing them back, and there was no end to the fight in sight. Arjun, we can't win this. Netravati called out, her voice urgent. But Arjun didn't answer. His face was set in grim determination, his focus entirely on Jaret. Netravati's heart sunk. She knew Arjun was trying to reach the part of Jaret that was still their friend, but the truth was that Jaret had already made his choice. He had already severed his ties to them. The battle was taking its toll. Leela was breathing heavily, her sword clumsy with fatigue. Rohan, though skilled, was showing signs of exhaustion. They couldn't keep this up for much longer. Netravati's mind raced, her thoughts frenzied as she calculated their next move. Rohan, fall back, she shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. We need to retreat now. Rohan hesitated, glancing at Netravati, but the desperation in her voice was enough. With a sharp nod, he turned, shouting to Leela, we're leaving. Leela didn't need any more encouragement. With a fierce look, she lashed out at the soldiers who had been closing in on her, creating a brief opening for her to retreat. Netravati turned to Arjun, who was still locked in combat with Jaret. She could see the conflict in his eyes. He wasn't ready to let go, not yet. But she knew what they had to do. Arjun, she shouted, her voice breaking through his focus. We have to go. Arjun's eyes met hers, and for the briefest moment, she saw a flicker of realization. He knew the truth. He knew that Jaret was lost to them, and there was nothing more they could do. With a final, reluctant glance at his former friend, Arjun broke away, following Netravati and the others as they retreated into the woods. The sound of their footsteps was drowned out by the cries of battle. But Netravati pushed forward, her heart heavy. She didn't know where they would go or how long they could keep running, but she knew one thing, Jaret was gone, and they had to survive no matter what. They moved quickly through the dense forest, their steps light but filled with urgency. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit echoed through the trees. The soldiers wouldn't let them escape so easily, but Netravati refused to look back. She couldn't afford to dwell on Jaret's betrayal, not when they still had a chance to escape. As they reached the edge of the forest, Netravati stopped for a moment, her chest heaving with exhaustion. The group gathered around her. their faces marked with the same mixture of fear and determination. "We'll have to double back," she said, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling within her. "We can't lead them to our hideout." The others nodded, their resolve hardening. They had been through so much, and they had come so far. They couldn't give up now. But as they disappeared into the deeper woods, one thought kept circling in Netravati's mind. How much could they trust each other now? Could the bonds they had forged survive this betrayal? Or had the world changed them all beyond repair? The silence that followed was thick and oppressive. But as they moved deeper into the forest, they knew one thing for certain. The battle was far from over. Chapter 20. Into the unknown, the forest around them grew denser as they ventured deeper into the unknown, the shadows of the trees growing longer with every step. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the distant hum of unseen creatures. Despite the calm of the surroundings, a sense of urgency pressed down on them, a weight that seemed to settle on their shoulders with each passing moment. Netravati led the way, her steps quick but purposeful. She had always been the one to guide them through the wilderness, but today felt different. The familiar comfort of the forest, once a trusted ally, now seemed more like a maze, full of uncertainty and danger. The betrayal by Jaret lingered in her thoughts like a bitter taste she couldn't wash away. "Arjun, do you think we'll be safe here?" Netravati asked quietly, her voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. Arjun, who was walking beside her, didn't immediately answer. His face was drawn, and there was a faraway look in his eyes, as if he was still caught in the aftermath of the battle. His fingers brushed against the hilt of his sword, a silent reminder of what had just transpired. "I don't know," he said finally, his voice low. "The soldiers will follow our trail. We'll need to move quickly and quietly. We can't afford to stop for long." Rohan and Leela had fallen behind, their pace slower than it had been earlier. The toll of the battle had left its mark on them. Bruises, exhaustion, and the heavy weight of the loss they had just endured. Netravati could feel the strain in their every step, the silent acknowledgement that they had been forced to leave much behind. "We need to find shelter," Leela said, her voice strained but resolute. "A place to rest. We can't keep running forever." Netravati nodded in agreement, but a part of her knew that rest was a luxury they couldn't afford. Every moment they lingered was another moment the enemy could catch up with them. But they needed to regain their strength. Their survival depended on it. They continued through the forest, the trees growing even thicker as they neared a steep ravine. The path was narrow, and the uneven ground made their progress slow. Netravati's mind raced as she scanned the surroundings, looking for any sign of danger, any clue that might give them a chance to slip past the soldiers in pursuit. "Netravati, over here," Rohan called from ahead, his voice urgent. He had found a small cave nestled into the side of the ravine, barely visible from the path they had been following. "This could work," Arjun said, his voice tight with exhaustion. "But we can't stay for long." Netravati nodded, pushing the thoughts of Jaret and the battle out of her mind for the moment. They needed to focus on the present, on survival. She motioned for the others to follow and led them into the cave. Inside, the space was small, barely large enough for all of them to sit in a circle. The cool stone of the walls pressed against them as they settled down, their bodies aching from the battle and the constant tension of their flight. For a long moment, none of them spoke. The silence was thick, oppressive. Each of them was lost in their own thoughts, processing what had happened. The betrayal, the battle, the escape, it was all too much to bear in one moment. Netravati sat against the wall, her arms wrapped around her knees, staring into the dim light that filtered through the entrance. The silence stretched on, broken only by the occasional sound of shifting gravel or the distant call of birds in the trees above. Finally, it was Arjun who spoke, his voice soft but heavy with the weight of their situation. "What now?" he asked, the question hanging in the air like a dark cloud. "Where do we go from here?" Netravati looked at him, her heart heavy. She had always been the one to lead, to have a plan, but now she was unsure. Jareta's betrayal had shaken her more than she cared to admit, and she could feel the fracture in their group. Trust had been broken, and that wasn't something easily repaired. "We keep moving," she said finally, her voice steady, though her heart was not. "We can't stop now. We have to find allies. We have to continue our mission." "But what about Jaret?" Leela asked, her voice tight with frustration. "What are we supposed to do about him? He's one of them now." The question hung in the air, unanswered. Netravati didn't know. She didn't know if they could ever bring Jaret back, if there was anything left to bring back. All she knew was that the mission they had started, the mission that had brought them all together, hadn't changed. They couldn't give up now, not when so much was at stake. "I don't know what happened to him," Netravati said, her voice low and distant. "But we can't afford to focus on that. We need to keep moving forward. For all of us." The others were silent, but there was a shared understanding in their eyes. They had lost a friend, a comrade, but they hadn't lost the cause. The world they were fighting for was still out there, waiting for them to fight for it. And as much as it hurt to think of Jaret as their enemy, there was no other choice. They had to press on. The night fell around them, and they huddled together for warmth, the flickering light of their fire casting long shadows on the walls of the cave. Sleep was a fleeting thing, each of them unable to fully relax, knowing the soldiers could be right on their heels. In the quiet of the night, Netravati closed her eyes, her mind whirling with thoughts of what had been lost and what was yet to come. She had never imagined it would come to this. But as the crackling of the fire filled the silence, one thing became clear. No matter what the world threw at them, they would face it together. Chapter 21. The whisper of hope, the morning light, filtered through the narrow entrance of the cave, casting faint shadows against the stone walls. Netravati was the first to stir, her body aching from the hard ground and the tension of the previous night. The others were still asleep, their faces soft with the rare peace that sleep had granted them. She stood slowly, trying not to disturb the others, and stepped to the edge of the cave entrance. The air was crisp, the scent of pine and earth still fresh from the rain that had fallen the night before. Despite the beauty of the dawn, her mind was clouded, her thoughts consumed with the same questions that had haunted her since the battle. What now? Where did they go from here? The sound of footsteps behind her made her turn. Arjun had risen early, as he often did, his movements quiet, but purposeful. He stood beside her, gazing out at the same scene, his expression unreadable. I didn't sleep, Arjun said, his voice low and hoarse. Too much on my mind. Netravati nodded, though she didn't feel the need to explain that she, too, had spent the night in restless contemplation. The loss of Jarej weighed heavily on them both, and yet there was a cold certainty in Netravati's heart that they could no longer afford to dwell on the past. They had to focus on the future. Arjun, Netravati said, her voice tight with the weight of the decision she knew they both had to make. We need to move forward. We can't keep hiding. Arjun turned to her, his brow furrowing. You mean we fight? I mean we keep looking for the allies we need, she replied, her gaze steady. We can't waste any more time. The longer we stay in hiding, the weaker we become. If we don't act soon, everything we've fought for will be lost. Arjun's eyes softened, the hardness of battle giving way to something gentler, something that still believed in hope. You're right, but it's hard to see how we can rally support when we've already lost so much. Netravati's heart twisted at the truth in his words. They had lost so much: Jarej, their sense of security, the belief that they were invincible together. But she knew something deeper than that. They still had each other. And if they wanted to survive this, they had to rebuild, piece by piece. We don't need everyone, Netravati said firmly. We need the right people. And I know there are others out there who will help us. We just have to find them. The morning stretched on, and one by one, the others awoke. Rohan was the first to speak, his voice gravelly but strong. We're still alive. That's something, right? Leela, ever practical, looked over at Netravati, her eyes scanning her face for any sign of doubt. What's the plan? She asked, not waiting for pleasantries. We can't stay here forever. Netravati hesitated only for a moment, gathering her thoughts. We move south. There are villages along the river. If we can reach them, we can find shelter, gather information, maybe even recruit more people for our cause. Rohan raised an eyebrow. A risky move, but it could work. Leela nodded, her eyes focused on the path ahead. We've got no other choice. It was settled then. They would leave the cave behind, take what supplies they could, and head for the southern river. Netravati knew the risks, but she also knew that time was not on their side. Every day they spent in hiding was a day the enemy grew stronger. The journey south was long and perilous, the dense forest giving way to open plains and winding rivers. For the first time in days, they traveled with a sense of purpose. But despite the forward momentum, Netravati's mind often wandered back to Jarej. She couldn't shake the image of him on the battlefield, standing against them with that cold, hardened expression. His betrayal had shattered something inside her, but she couldn't afford to linger on it. There were bigger things at stake now. As they moved along the river bank, they encountered few people. Most were either too afraid to speak, hiding from the same soldiers that hunted them, or they were too wary of strangers to offer any help. But the whispers of their arrival began to spread, and soon they reached a small village that had long been a stronghold for rebels, hidden from the eyes of the enemy, but still very much a part of the war. The village was a cluster of small huts, nestled among tall, swaying grasses. The people were poor, their clothes worn and patched, and their faces drawn with the strain of years of conflict. But there was a fire in their eyes, a quiet resilience that Netravati recognized immediately. As they approached, an older man, his face lined with age and hardship, stepped forward. His eyes studied them carefully, noting the weapons at their sides, the exhaustion in their movements. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unfriendly. "We are travelers," Netravati said, stepping forward. "We seek refuge, and we may have something to offer in return." The man's eyes narrowed. "Something to offer, you say? We fight against the same enemy." Arjun added, his voice calm but filled with conviction. "We need allies, and we believe you may be able to help us." The old man studied them for a moment longer, then nodded, signaling for them to follow. "We've heard whispers of a movement growing in the north. If you're part of that, perhaps you're worth listening to." As they entered the village, Netravati felt a strange sense of relief wash over her. They weren't alone. There were still others out there, others who believed in the cause, who were willing to fight. This wasn't over yet. She would rebuild, and they would fight together. The old man led them to a small, weathered building at the center of the village where a few others had gathered. The room was dimly lit, but the atmosphere was charged with the same quiet determination that Netravati had seen in her companions. These people were ready for change, ready for a fight. "We'll hear you out," the old man said, taking a seat at the head of the table. "But remember this, trust is earned, not given." Netravati took a deep breath, her gaze steady and clear. "We know that, but we've come a long way, and we're not turning back. We're here to win this war, together." As the conversation began, Netravati's heart lightened just a little. They were not alone, and for the first time in a long while, the future didn't seem so uncertain. The road ahead was long, but with allies at their side, they could see a path through the darkness. Chapter 22. The gathering storm. The air in the village was thick with anticipation as Netravati and her companions sat with the rebels. The room was cramped, but there was certain energy in the space, a quiet urgency that reverberated through every word exchanged. The people here had lived through war for so long. It seemed almost like a part of them, something they had come to accept as inevitable. But Netravati knew better. The fire she saw in their eyes wasn't born from resignation. It was born from the will to fight, to change. They sat in a circle, the old man, whom they had learned was named Arik, leading the conversation. He was a veteran of the war, though he seemed reluctant to speak of his past. The others, a mix of men and women, listened intently as Netravati and Arjun explained their mission and what had led them here. Their story of betrayal, the collapse of their original army, and the journey to find new allies resonated with the villagers. They were all too familiar with betrayal, having felt the sting of it from the very government they had once hoped would protect them. "I've heard of you," one of the women, a young rebel named Meera, said quietly. "There's talk of a group, of a woman who led them in the north. They say you're different, that you fight for something more than just survival." Netravati met Meera's gaze, her heart lifting slightly at the mention of her reputation. It was a reminder that, even in the darkest times, hope could spread like wildfire. I don't fight for survival, Netravati said firmly. I fight for the future, for something worth living for. A low murmur of agreement swept through the room, and Eric leaned forward, his expression serious. The South is not the safe heaven you think it is. The enemy has moved their forces closer to this area. They've taken control of several nearby towns, and we're feeling the pressure. But, he paused, as if weighing his words carefully. But I believe that if we unite, we can fight back. It won't be easy, but it's possible. Netravati's heart quickened. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The first step toward rallying the people who could tip the balance in their favor. She knew the road ahead would be fraught with danger, but there was no turning back now. What do you need from us? Netravati asked, her voice steady despite the rising tension in her chest. We need your strength, Eric said, his voice low but resolute. We've been fighting for so long, with so little. The enemy is strong, and they know we're here. We can't afford to make a misstep. But you have experience in battle, in strategy, and you have the trust of your people. That's what we need. A leader who can bring us together. Netravati looked around the room, her eyes scanning the faces of the rebels. They were worn, battered by years of war, but there was something undeniably powerful about them. They were survivors, fighters. And for the first time in a long while, Netravati felt the weight of their trust. We can do this, she said, her voice unwavering. But we need more than just strength. We need intelligence. We need to know where the enemy's forces are and how we can outmaneuver them. Eric nodded. We've been trying to gather information. We've got some scouts, but their numbers are few. The enemy is everywhere, watching every move we make. Netravati thought for a moment, then turned to Arjun. We'll need to organize our own scouts. We'll have to be quick, stealthy. We can't let them know we're coming. Arjun met her gaze, his eyes sharp with the same intensity she saw in her own reflection. I'll handle it. We can recruit a few trusted people here, set up an information network. But we'll need to move fast. And we'll need weapons, Leela added, her voice cutting through the tension. We've got a few, but we'll need more to take on the enemy head-to-head. And if we're going to fight back, we need to make sure we're well equipped. We'll do what we can, Eric said, standing up from his seat. There's an old armory not far from here. We've been too afraid to go near it for fear of drawing attention. But if you think it's worth the risk, Netravati's mind raced. If they could get to the armory, it would give them the resources they desperately needed. But it wouldn't be easy. They would have to sneak in, avoid detection, and hope the enemy hadn't already taken everything. It's worth the risk, she said, standing up as well. We don't have a choice. We'll take whatever we can carry. We'll leave tonight. There was a moment of silence, and then Meera spoke again. We'll help you. We know the terrain, and we've got people who can cover your backs. Good, Netravati said, meeting her eyes. We'll leave at dusk. Prepare yourselves. The rest of the day was spent in preparations. The rebels worked quickly and efficiently, gathering whatever they could from the village and preparing for the risky mission ahead. Netravati couldn't help but admire their resolve. Despite everything they had been through, they were still willing to fight, to stand up against the enemy that had taken so much from them. As the sun began to set, the group assembled near the edge of the village, ready to make their move. Netravati's heart pounded with a mix of excitement and apprehension. This was it, the moment that would decide whether they could push back the enemy or be swallowed by the darkness. "Stay close," Arjun said, his voice steady. "We move fast and we move quiet." Netravati gave him a small nod, her mind already shifting into battle mode. They had done this before in different circumstances, but the stakes were higher now. The enemy had their sights on them, and they couldn't afford a single mistake. With the village behind them and the night sky above, they set off into the darkness, moving as one, a unified force against the rising storm. The air was thick with tension, but there was also something else, a sense of purpose, of resolve. They were going to fight, and they were going to win. Together. Chapter 24. The cavalry arrives, the clash of swords, and the heavy breathing of the soldiers filled the air as Netravati fought with every ounce of strength she had left. Her arm ached from the effort, and her breath came in ragged gasps, but she refused to falter. She had come this far, not just for herself, but for the people who had placed their trust in her. She couldn't let them down. Not now. The soldiers surrounded her, closing in from every angle, their faces grim with determination. She could feel the pressure building, the weight of the battle pushing her back. Her movement slowed, the fight draining from her limbs as more and more soldiers pressed forward. But just as she felt herself faltering, she heard it, a sharp, piercing whistle that echoed through the trees. The sound was unmistakable. Arjun. The cavalry had arrived. In the distance, the sound of hooves pounding the earth grew louder. The ground trembled beneath her feet as a group of rebels on horseback burst through the trees, their figures silhouetted against the dim light of the clearing. They were a whirlwind of movement, swords raised high, their horses charging with an almost supernatural speed. Netravati's heart surged with renewed strength as the cavalry plowed through the enemy soldiers like a force of nature. The soldiers who had been closing in on her were thrown into disarray, caught off guard by the sudden appearance of the reinforcements. "Fall back," one of the enemy commanders shouted, his voice filled with panic. "Reinforcements, retreat." But it was too late. The rebels were upon them, cutting down any soldier who dared to resist. Netravati's mind raced as the battlefield shifted in her favor. The tide of battle had turned. She ducked under a swinging blade, and then pivoted, driving her own sword through the chest of an oncoming soldier. She didn't pause to look at him as he fell. There was no time for that. She was already moving, her eyes scanning the battlefield for any remaining threats. "Arjun," she shouted, spotting him in the chaos, his figure a beacon of determination as he fought at the forefront of the cavalry. His eyes met hers across the field, and for a moment, their gazes locked in mutual understanding. They had made it. The enemy began to crumble under the relentless onslaught, their formation breaking apart. One by one, the soldiers surrendered or fled, their will to fight shattered by the surprise attack. Netravati moved swiftly through the battlefield, her sword flashing as she helped to disarm and capture the remaining soldiers. The rebels, emboldened by the cavalry's arrival, fought with renewed vigor, pushing the enemy back. Within minutes, the clearing was silent, the battle over. The soldiers who had remained were either dead or captured, their weapons taken from them. Netravati stood in the center of the battlefield, her chest heaving as she surveyed the aftermath. The adrenaline began to wear off, leaving behind a deep exhaustion. But there was no time to rest. They had to move quickly before the enemy could regroup. "Arjun," she called, her voice hoarse from the effort. "We need to leave. Now." Arjun, covered in dirt and blood. rode up to her, his expression one of both relief and concern. "We are clear. The others are rounding up the prisoners." Netravati nodded. "Good. Let's get back to the village. We've done what we came here to do." The rebels began to regroup, gathering their wounded and collecting weapons. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. Netravati knew that this victory was just one step in a much larger fight. But it was a step they needed, a symbol that they could win, that they could take back what had been stolen from them. As the rebels mounted their horses and prepared to leave, Netravati took one last look at the armory. They had secured the weapons they needed, but it was more than that. This was a sign that the enemy could be defeated, that they could push back against the forces that had been oppressing them for so long. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time in a long while, Netravati felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time: hope. Chapter 25. The price of victory. The journey back to the village was a quiet one. The rebels moving through the dense forest with the weight of their hard-earned victory pressing on their shoulders. The hooves of the horses seemed to echo in the silence, the only other sound being the rustling of leaves in the cool evening breeze. Despite the triumph of their raid, Netravati felt no sense of celebration. The cost of the battle had been heavy, and the price of this victory was still to be fully realized. Arjun rode beside her, his face set in a grim line. He, too, seemed to understand that this was but one step in a much larger struggle. Their victory at the armory had given them the weapons they needed, but it hadn't come without sacrifice. "How many lost?" Netravati asked quietly, her eyes scanning the group of rebels who rode in front of her. Arjun's face darkened, and his voice was low. 3 dead, 4 more wounded." Netravati nodded, her heart heavy with the weight of their losses. 3 lives, gone in an instant. Each death a reminder of how fragile life was in this war. It was a price they had to pay, but it never felt easier to accept. She knew that war was cruel, that survival often came at the expense of those you loved, those you fought beside. But that didn't make it any less painful. "We did what we had to," Arjun added, sensing her thoughts. "The village will be safer for it." Netravati didn't respond right away. She looked ahead, her mind churning. Safer, yes, but for how long? The enemy wouldn't simply give up because they had lost one battle. There would be reprisals, and the rebels would have to be ready. "We need to prepare," she said finally, her voice steady. "This victory isn't the end. It's only the beginning." Arjun looked at her, understanding. "We'll need more supplies, more people." Netravati's eyes narrowed, and she nodded. "I'll speak to the council when we get back. But first, we need to tend to the wounded. We can't fight if we're not ready." The rebels made their way into the village as the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon. The familiar sight of the homes, the fields, and the bustling market brought a sense of comfort. But it was fleeting. The village was still fragile. The scars of war were everywhere. The walls that had been rebuilt after the enemy's last raid, the tension in the air, and the quiet whispers of fear that never quite went away. As they dismounted and led their horses to the stables, the villagers gathered around them, waiting for news of the raid. The rebels could see the worry on their faces, the uncertainty in their eyes. The price of their defiance was always the same, the possibility of retaliation. But Netravati could see something else, too. There was hope in their eyes. Hope that, despite everything, they could survive. That they could fight. "Arjun, gather the wounded," Netravati said, her voice firm. "I'll meet with the council." Arjun nodded and began to direct the others, helping to carry the injured into the makeshift infirmary. Netravati turned and made her way to the center of the village, where the council waited for her. They had always been skeptical of her plans, questioning whether the risk was worth the reward. But today, they would see the fruits of her labor, the result of their gamble. The council was seated in the same small building where they had made so many decisions over the past months. The air inside was thick with tension as Netravati entered, and all eyes turned to her. "You've returned," said Councillor Amir, his tone a mix of caution and curiosity. "And with the weapons?" Netravati nodded, her face unreadable. "We've secured the armory. We have rifles, ammunition, and enough swords to arm a small army." A murmur of approval rippled through the room, but it was tempered by the harsh reality of their situation. "And the casualties?" Councillor Samira asked, her voice tight with concern. "3 dead, 4 wounded," Netravati replied, her voice steady but heavy with the weight of the news. "We couldn't afford to lose anyone, but the battle was unavoidable. The enemy was too strong." The room fell silent at the mention of their losses. The council members exchanged looks, their faces filled with uncertainty and fear. This was the price of victory. They had gained what they needed, but the cost was always greater than they wanted to admit. "We have to keep fighting," Netravati said, breaking the silence. "We can't stop now. We have weapons, but we need to use them. The enemy won't sit idly by. They'll come for us, and we have to be ready." Councillor Amir sighed, his brow furrowed. "But we're running out of time. Every day we resist, we risk everything. The enemy's forces are growing stronger." Netravati stood taller, her voice unwavering. "Then we fight harder. We don't have the luxury of waiting for a better time. If we back down now, it will be over. They will take everything from us." Samira glanced around the room, her expression one of reluctant agreement. "She's right. We've come too far to turn back now." The other council members nodded, some with more hesitation than others, but all recognizing the truth in her words. The village could not afford to lose. They had to keep pushing forward, no matter the cost. "We'll need more recruits," Arjun said, entering the room with several other rebels, including the wounded. "And supplies. We've barely scratched the surface of what we need to take on the enemy." Netravati turned to him, nodding. "We'll organize a recruitment effort. The more we have, the better our chances." As the council began to discuss logistics and strategy, Netravati stepped to the side, her mind worrying with plans. She knew the road ahead would only get harder, but she also knew this was their only chance. They had to fight with everything they had. Chapter 26. Whispers in the dark. The night air was still, but the village was restless. Children clung to their mothers. Elders sat in circles, murmuring prayers or fears. No one could tell the difference anymore. The firelight flickered across the narrow paths, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch into the unknown. For all the weapons they had gained, there was a greater enemy looming: fear. Netravati stood outside the council hall, watching the night like a sentinel. Her body ached, her mind raced, but she could not rest. Too much depended on what came next. A soft sound made her turn. Arjun, approaching quietly. "You haven't slept," he said, offering her a tin mug of herbal broth. "Neither have I." Netravati took it gratefully, sipped slowly, and looked toward the northern ridge. "They're not done with us. I can feel it. Before the week is out, they'll strike back." Arjun didn't argue. "We've lit the match. Now we brace for the fire." A hosh fell between them until Netravati broke it. "I want to go to the mountain outposts. Talk to the hill tribes myself." Arjun raised an eyebrow. "That's a long journey. Dangerous. And you're not exactly unknown anymore." "All the more reason," she replied. "They won't follow a stranger, but they might follow someone who bled for this cause." He studied her face in the firelight. "You'd leave the village now?" She nodded. "I have to. We don't just need fighters, we need believers. We need alliances." Arjun exhaled. "Then I'll go with you." Netravati smiled faintly. "You always say that, because it's always true." As they made their preparations, a young boy ran up to them, breathless, wide-eyed. "Netravati," he gasped, "someone's come from the capital. A woman. She says she knows you." Alarm surged in her chest. "Where is she?" "At the old well," the boy said. "She won't come closer. Netravati and Arjun exchanged a glance, then followed the boy through the alleys until they reached the well. There, in the half-light, stood a lone figure in a dark cloak. As Netravati approached, the woman removed her hood. Her breath caught. It was Leena, once her closest friend, once her betrayer. Netravati stiffened. "Why are you here?" Leena looked tired, thinner than she remembered. "To warn you. The army's moving. 30 units. West Ridge to River Basin. They plan to trap you in." Netravati narrowed her eyes. "Why would you help me now?" Leena stepped closer. "Because I saw what they did to my brother. Because I saw what you became. I didn't believe before, but I do now." Arjun stepped forward, his hand on his dagger. This could be a trick. Netravati held up a hand. Or a miracle. Leena reached into her cloak and pulled out a folded map. "They're coming in 2 days. At dawn. This is your only advantage." Netravati studied the map. It was detailed, military grade. "Real. Why would they trust you with this?" She asked. "I was part of the planning. I've been waiting for a moment to escape." Arjun stepped between them. "What do you want in return?" "Nothing," Leena said. "Only forgiveness, if that's still possible." Netravati looked at her for a long moment. "Trust must be earned. But we'll see." They took the map and returned to the council. That night, a new plan was drawn. Netravati would still go to the mountain tribes, but now they had a deadline. 2 days. As dawn broke, she looked out from the watchtower and whispered to herself, "We're not running anymore. We're rising." Chapter 27. The mountain oath the path to the mountains was steep and treacherous, veiled in mist and guarded by silence. Netravati and Arjun rode slowly, their horses picking their way through jagged stones and narrow trails where even sunlight struggled to reach. With every twist of the road, they rose higher into the unknown and closer to the people whose allegiance might tip the balance of the war. The hill tribes had always been fiercely independent. For centuries, they'd resisted all rulers, kings, colonists, and now generals. No army had ever fully subdued them. Their lands were rocky and poor, but their pride was rich, and their warriors were legendary. If Netravati could win their trust, she would not only gain fighters, but also earn a symbol of resistance that could inspire every village across the region. "This terrain is no place for diplomacy," Arjun muttered, adjusting the strap of his satchel. "Are you sure they'll even talk to us?" "They know we're coming," Netravati said. "I sent the message with the smoke signals 3 days ago. They'll watch us long before we see them." And indeed, as they crossed a ridge shaded by ancient pine trees, a whistle sliced the wind, sharp, deliberate. Within seconds, 5 tribal warriors appeared from the rocks, arrows drawn, faces masked in soot and leaves. One stepped forward. His face was painted with dark blue streaks, his eyes wary. "You bring the fire," he said in the mountain dialect. "Why?" Netravati stepped down from her horse, slowly. "Because the fire is already upon us all, and we must choose, burn alone or rise together." The warrior narrowed his eyes. "You speak like the plains people, but your eyes, they have seen death. They've seen betrayal, and they've seen hope." A pause. Then, with a subtle hand gesture, the warrior motioned them forward. "Follow." They walked for an hour deeper into the crags, to a hidden village carved into the cliffs, stone huts blending into the rock, goats grazing on impossibly steep ledges. A bonfire smoked in the center, where a ring of elders awaited. At the heart sat old Harnak, a warlord of legends, with silver braids and a scar across his cheek that Netravati remembered from stories told in whispers. He stared at her like one might regard a storm cloud, powerful but dangerous. "You are the girl who defeated the capital," Harnak said. "The one they now call ghost-blooded." Netravati inclined her head. "If you mean I survived what should have killed me, yes, that's me." The elders muttered among themselves. Harnak raised a hand. "You've come to ask for warriors. We don't give blood for nothing." "I've come to ask for loyalty. We both want the same thing, Freedom. Harnak grunted. Freedom? A nice word. It means nothing when your child is hungry or your fields are ash. Arjun stepped forward. We've taken weapons from the enemy. We've built a rebellion. We've begun something real. Netravati added. And in 2 days, the army will surround our valley. Unless we stand together, we fall separately. There was silence. Then Harnak stood slowly, and all the elders did the same. He picked up a ball of mountain ash mixed with water and approached her. If you are worthy, he said, you will take the mountain oath. Speak truth. Carry pain. Die before betrayal. Netravati met his gaze and nodded. He dipped his fingers into the ash and smeared a streak across her forehead. Repeat after me, he said. I am the fire that cannot be quenched, Netravati began. I am the stone that does not yield, she said after him. I am the storm that will not bow, she finished. A deep chant rose from the elders. The oath was complete. Harnak turned to the crowd that had gathered. She walks with fire, he declared. Let the mountain walk with her. The warriors lifted their spears and shouted into the sky. Netravati stood tall, the ash burning into her skin like a brand. In that moment, she knew something had changed. She wasn't just leading a rebellion now. She was becoming its legend. Chapter 28, Blood on the Horizon 2 days. That was all the time they had. Netravati, now sworn in the mountain oath, descended from the cliffs with a new army at her back. Fierce, unyielding, barefoot warriors with eyes like sharpened flint. They moved fast and silent through the forest, their drums beating low and steady, a rhythm that echoed in the hearts of those waiting in the valley. Arjun rode beside her, scanning the eastern sky. They'll strike at dawn, he said. If your friend's map was right. Netravati nodded. She's risked everything to get it to us. We trust it, and we trust the people. The village below was no longer just a farming hamlet. Men, women, even children stood with spears or slings, wearing armor cobbled from scrap, leather, or old tin shields. What they lacked in weapons, they made up in will. The returning mountain tribes were received like heroes. The villagers cheered when they saw the tattoos of the hawk and hammer on their arms, symbols of defiance older than any empire. By midnight, final defenses were set. Hidden trenches, watchfires, rope traps across the eastern trail. Netravati stood with her command circle, Arjun, Old Harnak, Leora, and 2 of the younger scouts who would proven themselves in past raids. We let them come, Harnak growled, pointing to the narrow pass. When they're in the belly of the valley, we strike. Leora added, their formation will be tight at first, but once they believe they've cornered us, they'll spread. That's when we use the ridge. Netravati turned to the group. Tonight is not about victory. It's about the message. We stand. We do not run. If we fall, the world will still know we chose to fight. She paused, looking around. And if we win, then the revolution truly begins. A hush followed her words. Then one of the scouts raised his spear and whispered, for Netravati. The whisper spread, for Netravati, for Netravati, for all of us. And then, just before dawn, the drum stopped. A single horn echoed in the valley. Shrill and mechanical, the enemy had arrived. From the hills came the thud of boots, the gleam of metal, dozens of torchlights bobbing in the morning mist. The army was here, uniformed, organized, trained. But as they crossed into the gorge, they found no resistance, just silence, until the first trap snapped shut. Spikes, fire pits, falling rocks. Chaos erupted before they even reached the village gates. Screams pierced the fog, and horses reared and broke ranks. Then, the horns of the mountain tribes, a thunderous call from the high ridge, and from above, warriors descended like hawks in the wind. Netravati charged at the front, her blade flashing, eyes blazing. Arjun was at her side, parrying and shouting orders. Harnak's men moved like phantoms, slashing, vanishing, reappearing behind enemy lines. And just when the tide seemed to falter, Leora emerged from behind the enemy flank, firebombs in hand. She set the command wagon ablaze, scattering their officers and turning their strategy to smoke. By mid-morning, it was over. The valley was scarred, but standing. The army was broken. Those who lived surrendered. Others fled into the woods. The people had won. Netravati stood atop the watchtower, wind in her hair, blood on her sleeves. Looking out at the battlefield below, a single tear ran down her cheek, not from grief, not from pain, but from something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Chapter 30. Her name was Netravati months past. The valley that once echoed with the cries of war now hummed with the steady rhythm of life and preparation. Fields, once trampled, blossomed again. Children laughed where blood once spilled, but there was no forgetting, only forging. The rebellion had spread like wildfire. From the forests of the east to the river towns of the west, stories were whispered of a girl who stood against soldiers, who united tribes, who fought with fire in her eyes. They called her many things: ghost-blooded, the flame-bearer, the mountain oath. But most knew her simply by the name her mother had given her, Netravati. She sat on the ridge one morning, above the village, watching the rising sun. Beside her sat Arjun, thinner now, still healing, but stronger every day. Below, new recruits trained. Old Harnak barked commands. Leora oversaw strategy maps. Even the children practiced with wooden spears. "It's strange," Arjun said, "how peace feels more dangerous than battle." Netravati nodded. "Because in battle, you know who the enemy is. And now, we have to build something and protect it from becoming the very thing we fought." Arjun studied her. "Do you ever think about leaving? Running far from all this?" She smiled. "I used to, but I realized I don't carry the fire. I am the fire." Behind them, footsteps approached. Leora, winded from climbing, handed her a scroll. "Another message," she said, "from the southern border. They're ready to rise." Netravati took the scroll and stared at the seal. A simple mark, 3 lines crossed over a flame. The mark of the resistance. She stood slowly, tucking the message into her belt. "We move at dusk," she said. "Send the signal." Leora grinned. "The whole country's watching us now." Netravati looked toward the horizon, where the sky burned with dawnlight. "Let them watch," she said. "Let them remember that we did not wait for heroes. We became them." As she descended the ridge, her figure silhouetted against the morning sun, people gathered around her. Warriors, healers, farmers, the once forgotten. They didn't need speeches anymore. Her presence was enough. Because she wasn't just their leader. She was the story they would pass on. The girl who chose to fight. The woman who never knelt. The fire that would never die. Her name was Netravati.